It's been 12 years since the first Avengers movie hit theaters. I was already 19 years old at the time, yet somehow it feels like this franchise has been there my entire life. Looking at a franchise that is now 33 films deep, you could look back and think them reaching that Avengers movie as their sixth almost felt inevitable. Obviously they would reach that point, how could they not? Everyone loves these movies. Keep in mind, this was still a completely unproven concept. There had been crossover or event films in the past, but always done as goofy gimmicks like Freddy vs. Jason or Alien vs. Predator. It was nothing that anyone put the time or effort into properly building up. Universal Studios' classic monster collection is probably the earliest example of a cinematic universe, but they only started marketing those movies as a complete franchise many years later. That was never how they were first positioned. Even when prior superhero series like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Blade, or X-Men had performed well, crossing any of those characters over with other corners of Marvel's catalog never came to fruition. Mostly because the character rights were split across many different studios, but it also just wasn't something you did. A cinematic universe was unheard of and seen as a massive risk. How could you possibly trust the audience to track all these pre-event films, make them care enough about the characters to want to see them come together, and not have that eventual film just be 6 protagonists all fighting for center stage? Pulling that all together felt doomed to be a catastrophic mishmash of personalities, themes, tones, and styles. There are plenty of people who went to see that Avengers movie simply because they were curious to see someone attempt that. It didn't matter if it was good or bad, we hadn't really seen it before. It feels so clear in hindsight that this was a niche that needed to be filled, treating comic book movies like actual serialized intertwining comic books. Looking at Phase 1, while the Iron Man movies were easily the 2 most commercially successful of those first 5, everything was well enough received to keep things afloat. Nothing was an outright bomb, although Hulk was really flirting with an edge there, and everything was at least liked critically. Those Rotten Tomatoes scores are a little up and down, and those box office numbers look tame compared to the eventual $982 million box office average of those first 23 Infinity Saga films. The later success of the franchise really brought up the average there, but the groundwork had been carefully laid, spacing these releases out, allowing these movies to exist on their own, be developed largely independently, with only the smallest inclusions hinting at the larger universe. Across 4 years, that hype was slowly starting to build, and the audience for the MCU was slowly being found. It's hard to communicate just how much people were boiling over in anticipation by the time the Avengers finally began its marketing. Captain America: The First Avengers post-credit scene is a trailer for the Avengers, which would be coming 1 year later. Superfans were frothing at the mouth, while the general audience had successfully been convinced that this might be worth checking out. There was no such thing as superhero fatigue. That buzzword hadn't emerged yet. All we wanted was to see if this movie could fulfill the promise of an Avengers movie. That year-long gap leading up to the Avengers movie was so smart. And honestly, the naming of the first Avenger being the last film before the team-up was kinda brilliant. They turned every marquee into a piece of marketing for this eventual team-up. People had the Avengers tumbling around in their mind with plenty of time to catch up at home now that we knew these were all connected and were guaranteed to see it all come together. It's easy to take for granted now that these characters come and go within each other's movies so casually. Of course you can just bash these characters together in group movies. Nothing could be simpler, right? For years after, Sony, Fox, and DC have struggled to get their footing and replicate this massive success, while Marvel has been chugging along, making it all look easy. And really, none of them have even come close to building franchises this successful and well-liked. But believe me, if that first Avengers movie was poorly received, the word of mouth wouldn't have been nearly as strong. Justice League is the main example of that. They had Superman and Batman in a movie and still struggled. So if the Avengers never caught on and failed to make a substantial profit, this 2012 movie might have been the end of the entire Avengers initiative. No other MCU movie had started filming by the time the Avengers released. Iron Man 3 was deep into pre-production, but if this movie tanked, who knows what would have happened to the franchise. Those doubts were quickly squashed. Lo and behold, the Avengers earned a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, its reception coming only second to that first Iron Man, and earning Marvel Studios their first ever A+ cinema score, which is basically a measure of how much fun the audience had, propelling it to gross $1.5 billion. It became the third highest grossing movie of all time behind Avatar and the Titanic. The Avengers was the highest grossing movie of 2012 by a margin of nearly $500 million. They wiped the floor with the likes of a successfully rebooted Bond film, the conclusion of Nolan's much-beloved Dark Knight trilogy, and the freaking Hobbit. That's stupid. It wasn't even close. Iron Man 3 came a year later, now also earning over $1 billion. Then we have Thor 2, despite having issues, took a 50% box office bump over his origin film. Captain America 2 nearly doubled his initials revenue, and as quickly as that, Marvel had built the confidence to get funky with it, creating riskier movies like Guardians, which then became a massive breakout success all of its own, and even an oddball character like Ant-Man, someone totally unknown, managed to outgross the Incredible Hulk, Thor 1, and Captain America 1 simply because it had that Marvel name attached to it. Age of Ultron came only 3 years later, and actually earned slightly less than the initial Avengers. I'm trying really hard to avoid calling it the first Avengers to avoid confusion, so in that way, maybe long term that wasn't the best name for the Captain America movie, but it certainly did its job back in the day. Ultron's reviews were shaky, sitting at a 76 on Rotten Tomatoes. Nothing to turn your nose up at, but not at all up to the standard Marvel had set for themselves. Out of the 11 movies so far, it was the fourth least well received, only topping the likes of The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, and Thor 2. It was many years before any other movies ended up in that bottom of the barrel critically of the MCU. At the time, it was considered a pretty far fall in grace for this building franchise. Maybe they could fail at some point. Even so, it was at that time still the fifth highest grossing movie of all time. Avatar and the Titanic are still up there, now the Avengers and Furious 7. It's funny to see this as an underperformance, but everyone expected it would outperform the original. But come on, it's only a failure relative to the unimaginable towering success of this larger franchise. Luckily, they didn't let it slow their roll. For the next decade, Marvel soared as a seemingly unstoppable force of box office and pop culture domination, only faltering for the first time during these last couple years. And thankfully, they seem to be taking action to course correct, but in some ways, it's almost more interesting than ever to be paying attention to what Marvel is doing now that we're seeing some of the holes in their armor. The Avengers proved a team-up movie could work. Age of Ultron proved that a shared growing universe and constantly building franchise not only worked, but still had so much more to give. And the majority of the Infinity Saga films build off at least one of these two, either using the invasion of New York or the destruction of Sokovia as instrumental building blocks to tell larger, ever-expanding stories. These event movies are all about seeing our favorite heroes come together for epic adventures, but they were both also positioned in pivotal ways that allow subsequent solo movies to hit the ground running. That first Avengers was so well liked because it stands on its own so well, and Age of Ultron has, in my mind, aged incredibly well because of what an important role it tells in the larger story. Now, with this growing series putting out 4 movies a year and a litany of Disney Plus series dropping in between those, they are asking a lot of the general audience to keep up with all that. It's a dream come true for someone like myself, but it also means it's likely been 10 years since the majority of people were bothering to watch each and every new MCU movie that came out. Infinity War, Endgame, and No Way Home have all proven people will always be drawn to massive event blockbusters. But I don't think we'll ever again capture the magic of those early days when everyone was seemingly paying an equal amount of attention to everything Marvel was cooking up. It was a really exciting time, and it really cemented the legacy of this franchise. In case you skipped ahead in the video, for this review I am pairing up both the original Avengers and Age of Ultron. I think this makes sense on multiple levels, not just for my own sake with video scheduling. Through my Trilogy of Trilogy reviews, I have actually already discussed every pre-Ultron movie other than Guardians of the Galaxy, and that movie had zero impact on the events of Ultron, so we're free and clear in that regard. The other, much larger reason is that the first two and second two Avengers movies exist as pairs delineated by their respective directors. Joss Whedon handled the first two, and Anthony and Joe Russo did the next two. So there shouldn't be any inconsistent directorial stylings that need to be accounted for, but there certainly are differences across all four movies. So I'll use this section to talk in generalities of things that apply to both the Avengers and Age of Ultron. And it just so happens that this first pair of Avengers movies were directed by someone we now know is a big piece of shit. That really sucks to learn, because what Whedon did with these characters, being the first to have them all play together on screen, executing massive splash page style action sequences, keeping the dialogue and exposition light, breezy, and fun, and to then somehow stick the landing on all of that with such a massive pressure and weight looming overhead is nothing short of astounding. Considering those skeletons were still in his closet, it felt inarguable to us moviegoers that he was the right guy for the job. He represented us nerds, and we trusted him to do the comics justice. I think some people have difficulty praising these movies now, not wanting to give Joss Whedon any credit. So I kinda have to teleport myself back 10 years to watch these movies with all that pushed aside and attempt to look at them without that bias. For the sake of not repeatedly derailing this video to talk about him as a person, I'm stuffing it all at the top here. I really like the end result of what he did with these movies. Obviously, if we could do it all over, we'd all wish that someone less garbage would have had that opportunity instead. Whedon made his money a long time ago, so continuing to watch and appreciate these movies isn't going to feed into his pocket. I feel like we can adequately separate art and artist in this scenario without having to get bogged down in that conversation. So yeah, I think the guy sucks on a human level, but as a writer, a director, and comic book fan getting his hands on these movies, he kind of crushed it. For anyone who is unfamiliar with Whedon's writing and other works, this first dose of his style of dialogue was a delight for many. He was writing in his absolute prime on the Avengers. The quippy, pop culture-laden, snarky meta-commentary, rapid-fire, unrealistic styling that have defined his career were new and fresh on the big screen and came in full force in these movies. I grew up watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so for me it was already something comfortable and familiar, probably without me even realizing it at the time. But I imagine it's not everybody's cup of tea. Because Whedon approaches dialogue so unrealistically, when it misses hard. The best way to define his writing style is that every character is using a secret additional superpower they all share to instead deliver the optimal version of their line that they would have written for themselves in their mind later that evening on the drive home.
Oh, yes! That's what I should have said! Damn it!
Everyone always has the perfect line, comeback, or retort ready to fire at all times. While not always, it is often style over substance. But in The Avengers, he managed to combine that flash with some excellent storytelling, engaging characters, phenomenal performances, clear and believable chemistry, perfect deliveries, all coming across through Marvel's very lived-in world. And that stylish prose felt very at home in a comic book story.
We have no quarrel with your people.
An ant has no quarrel with a boot.
you planning to step on us?
This heightened dialogue creates instantly iconic moments, quotable one-liners, while also informing the characters and progressing the story forward. It's a phenomenal juggling act.
Once you accept that in your heart, you will know peace.
Yeah, you say peace. I kind of think you mean the other thing.
Nobody talks like that, but it's effective, creative, and carries a certain degree of poetry. Having characters engage like this comes with a certain rhythm that is perfect for an ensemble film filled with big personalities. The more they can bounce off one another, riff, and circle it back around, the more quickly we get to understand these characters and understand how they mesh together. The drawback can be that most of the characters end up having the same voice. Any line feels like it could have been delivered by any character. It flattens out a lot of the nuance of a character like Steve Rogers, while elevating someone comedic like Tony Stark. I believe the saving grace in the first Avengers is that as these characters are getting to know one another, they are much more clearly separated in their beliefs and attitudes, allowing these characters to bring out some distinctness in their interactions. And while I love the writing in the Avengers,
They will. They'll come for you.
I have an army.
We have a Hulk.
and Age of Ultron is also packed with insanely good quotes of its own.
The most versatile substance on the planet. And they used it to make a frisbee.
I can't deny that Whedon misses much more often in that second movie.
Romanoff, you and Banner better not be playing hide the zucchini.
Throughout that second Avengers movie, with the team now being on the same page, lacking a lot of that friction of the first movie, the dialogue does come across more samey across the team. They're not all identical, but the lines are really getting blurred. Maybe this rocky writing was due to being so incredibly burnt out from making the first Avengers? I'll dig into what separates the writing in these movies more deeply within those individual reviews. And speaking more broadly across the franchise, often to their own detriment, this constant goofing around and levity now permeates almost every corner of the MCU and largely defines these films for many. Characters were jokey before and after the Avengers. It's always been a defining quality of these family-friendly adventures. And luckily, I think through this rewatch, I'm learning that they very infrequently try to mimic that Whedon style of writing and delivery. Yes, characters quip and joke, and maybe it's changed a hair from how it existed in Phase 1 of the MCU, but I don't think they ever came quite back around to lines like this.
Invaders create Avengers. People create smaller people. Children. I lost the word there. Children.
Whether or not you like that line, I don't think that level of try-hard quirkiness really exists in that very Whedon-esque way outside of these two movies. Instead, I think it comes down to Robert Downey Jr.'s scene-stealing turn as Tony Stark in 3 movies at this point, combined with the Avengers' runaway success that did firmly inform the studio that audiences love when these movies are through and through comedic. So while I disagree that the entire franchise became a Whedon-inspired quip fest after the Avengers, that movie did perhaps set the precedent that more serious, joke-free sections in the script were not really necessary. It has taken these movies a long time to overcome that, and it still frequently plagues them. But none of the rest of these movies ever again came close to that Whedon maximalist style of writing. While we're talking about ways the Avengers shaped the entirety of the MCU, while this isn't any one person's fault, the Avengers also marked a turning point where passing one-line references to the larger universe didn't cut it. Ever since then, these movies always include a team-up, a cameo, a substantial name drop, tripping over themselves to set up a future movie or some other direct connection to larger events to make certain you don't forget that you're watching a Marvel Avengers franchise movie. As for Whedon's actual directing across the 2 movies, it's quite wildly different, so I'll be discussing that within the individual reviews. Now that I've covered some blanketing points as well as the elephant in the room, let's dig into the meat of 2012's The Avengers. The first ever superhero team-up movie and the true starting point of the cinematic universe as we know it. This was it. This was the movie that made me and so many other people around the world fall in love with this franchise. There was plenty of enjoyment to be had in the prior Phase 1 movies, but they existed in this bubble where it felt like we could take or leave the movies we wanted, and Iron Man 1 was the only one considered a must-see. I myself had watched them quite casually. Marvel built this event movie in a way that allowed people to enjoy it with zero knowledge of the previous movies. But they also had the confidence to include plenty of gags, references, and beats that rewarded anyone who bothered to watch every other movie first. And suddenly, everyone I knew was a massive Avengers fan and were ranking characters like Captain America higher than Spider-Man on their all-time favorite lists. How wild is that? You look at it now and think, yeah, that's the Avengers. Marvel never would have chose this as their first lineup if they had access to all their characters. And the fact that they had to work so hard to win over the audience, I think, benefited them immensely. In recent years, I've heard people look back more critically at this movie, but I don't think a single person walked out of those theaters without a big smile plastered across their face. Let's talk about Whedon's directing in this first Avengers right away, as it's one of the biggest knocks against the movie that has emerged over time. Overall, this movie largely avoids the washed out gray on gray color grading that plagues the middle chunk of the Infinity Saga, but it's still visually lacking in other ways. I think the majority of the action is still phenomenal and mostly looks great. It's filled with incredible moments that feel lifted straight from the pages of the comic books. Maybe not done quite as literally as someone like Zack Snyder does it, but it's more like an inspired by visual reference. That's not the issue I have with it. There is instead an approach here that even in some of the coolest, most well-shot stuff, still leaves everything looking a little off. Joss Whedon came from a background of TV directing and largely pulled from that toolkit for this feature film. Mainly, the aspect ratio is closer to TV than most movies. But also, more than that, it's lit in a way that flattens out most scenes. Not through color, but more through composition, blocking, lens choices, and staging. And something that certainly doesn't help matters, half of this movie takes place on this bland, steel, disinteresting helicarrier setting. And while yes, that features a lot of gray, it's at least not a final pass filter over the entire movie, sucking all the saturation and contrast out of it. Every frame, a painting pretty famously ripped apart this specific dialogue scene as being disinteresting with an unmotivated camera. And while it's not the most visually engaging, I think that discredits it a little too heavily. It's still using basic directorial tricks. For example, Cap and Tony have opposing ideals, so Fury is positioned to physically split them in the wide shot. The camera is moving in the same direction for each of them as they're being drawn into Fury's words. Once he's said his piece, the camera then stops moving around, allowing them to draw their own conclusions. And Tony leaves the table, seemingly rejecting what he's heard. There's nothing groundbreaking there or overtly eye-grabbing, but I don't think this scene would have been better if the camera was zooming around, doing aggressive close-ups or anything super flashy. But combine some pretty standard ways of filming a dialogue scene with this boring set, on top of Whedon obviously leaning on a long career of TV-oriented work, and the end result is a scene that serves as some fairly low-hanging fruit to criticize Whedon's directing. It's not unforgivable, but it does compress several of the issues with the directing in this movie into one scene to easily point to. And while it doesn't totally absolve him of any fault, the thing is, he was trying to achieve something specific that he did actualize pretty damn well for better or worse. Whedon was actively rejecting the gritty realism that was taking hold of comic book movies after Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, and he instead aimed to make a bright and cartoony comic book page-feeling film. Nearly a decade earlier, Ang Lee had his insane comic book panel style transitions, and even in the MCU, Kenneth Branagh attempted to make it feel more like a comic book in Thor 1 with his relentless Dutch angles. Directors were out here trying to find a way to bridge the gap between comic and cinema, and Whedon attempted it through a non-cinematic aspect ratio, brightly lit scenes, and plenty of superhero posing. It was a relatively interesting approach. At a time when realism was dominating the comic book movie landscape, Whedon did the inverse approach. He kept the movie's story, tone, costuming, and everything else as fantastical as possible, while filming it in a way that felt like real events rather than something hyper-cinematic. Another way to think of it, rather than asking, how do you make Batman feel realistic? He asked, how do you make someone unrealistic like the Hulk feel like he could be in our real, actual world? It's a mixed bag. There are still some color and grading issues. Like, it's not impossible for a movie set with gray technological interiors and gray cityscape exteriors to pop on screen. Look at Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, also set in New York, so it's a really good comparison. Raimi keeps things so visually interesting, dynamically lit, and all still shot and presented cinematically. Even when these city shots are both set in the daytime, it's a night and day difference. Again, Whedon played to his personal strengths and chose to do it this way. Nearly any scene that takes place beyond the helicarrier or city streets actively disproves that the entire movie is washed out or completely lacking color or saturation. That just happens to be a product of where the majority of the movie was set. But there's no denying that Iron Man and the Avengers being the most successful and most grayly set and filmed movies of the franchise hurt the cinematography of the MCU for a long time, crushing down the bright weirdness of movies like Doctor Strange and Guardians of the Galaxy. While the TV-esque approach is worth critiquing in this movie, it probably is its biggest standout flaw. I don't think it's as horrible as people say and doesn't remotely ruin the movie for me. The ways it accidentally destroyed the visual stylings of these movies for the next 5 years is the much larger issue. It affected the franchise much more negatively than it did this actual movie. And it's hard to know if we should blame Whedon and co. or blame the studio for taking the wrong lessons from the success of the Avengers. I mentioned it in a previous one of these videos, it definitely goes back to that Marvel Creative Committee, who's kinda to blame for a lot of the issues in these movies back in the day. They are to blame for squeezing Edgar Wright out of the Ant-Man movie, trying to push Gunn to ditch his 70s soundtrack in Guardians, among 1,000 other decisions that hurt these movies. Smushing everything down into this house style was definitely their fault. But they wouldn't have had that to pull from if some of their directors hadn't done it first. It's a messy situation. Something that feels obvious now, but I think was a really clever aspect of the writing of the Avengers was the use of Loki as the villain. This film had to dedicate so much time to bringing the characters together and selling us on them as a team, so they couldn't really afford time spent on establishing some new villain. And of course, they turned to Loki, by far the most nuanced and well-established villain. One who could easily command the screen, carried a certain degree of sympathy watching his fall from Asgard, someone who heralded from space so that it made sense for him to bring an army of generic aliens along with him, and finally someone who existed as a major threat all on his own. With that criteria, the obvious choice here was Loki. Let's get real. This movie would be garbage if this lead Chitauri guy were the lead villain the whole time. Dropping Loki in here fits the storytelling requirements of the franchise while also being a really smart entry point for the viewer. We know plenty about this character that they don't have to spend time establishing. And if you didn't see the first Thor, they quickly catch you up on the fact that he's Thor's brother, he's adopted, and he's pretty damn unstable. The opening sequence of Loki invading this S.H.I.E.L.D. base to steal the Tesseract is a little undercut by these being many of the least interesting characters in the franchise. It just makes it feel a little underwhelming on some level, but that's kind of the point. It's still a pretty good action-oriented set piece, and there were no Avengers to deal with it. It's regular people getting absolutely stomped by the big bad. It shows that they're totally out of their league, and they basically stay out of the way the rest of the movie. S.H.I.E.L.D. is even forced to pull this Hail Mary of destroying the entirety of their own facility just to try and slow him down. Excessive? Maybe. An exciting way to start a movie? You bet. It's a little absurd when Maria and Clint are driving their cars face to face, yet can't shoot each other. Come on, Fury had a more accurate shot out of his helicopter. But I do like that Loki is out there shooting out the back of a truck like he's manning the gun on the back of a warthog in Halo. Things start off with a bang, and we have a hard cut to the title reveal and a tease of that excellent Avengers theme song. To this day, Loki remains one of their most engaging characters, drifting back and forth across that line of full-on villain, still seeking some final redemption. And here we learn that after being lost adrift in the universe, Thanos scooped him up, promising him Earth in exchange for the Tesseract. Thanos is never named in the movie, but we know now it was him who sent Loki. So while the god of mischief appears to want to rule, he is here against his will, being positioned as the villain without any real say in it. And after his life got kind of blown apart in the original Thor, he's leaning further into that and trying to find his place in a fully evil role. But as we come to see more directly in this scene meeting with the Chitauri leader, Loki has been conscripted in this war and is now an unwilling participant. But while he's here, he's trying to take advantage and manipulate this forced position for his own gains. You know, like he does in every movie he's in. So the way the character is written and presented throughout the movie is pretty flat. He just is evil and he's here to do bad things. But anything we read between the lines or the added context we've been given with the movies that came before and after, there's some really interesting progression in his overall character arc taking place throughout this movie. That is so much more well presented in this movie than I ever gave it credit for before. Loki first arrives on Earth like a sweaty little freak. He actually looks like he's been through hell, and it's easy for us to quickly believe that this Loki is now fully evil. It's so much later in the movie that we see glimpses of his true self.
Look around you! You think this madness will end with your rule? It's too late. It's too late to stop it.
I think they gave us the best of both worlds. A ruthless through and through villain whose only motivation is destruction and to rule, which can be fun to watch but usually isn't that engaging. But also, there's a depth to the character that still exists below the surface, peeking out in small intervals to show us he as a character extends well beyond the seemingly generic motivations. The assembling of the Avengers in this movie is exceptionally well done. There is a delicate balance here where the movie assumes we know these characters, but it makes sure to introduce them in ways that all serve to inform the audience exactly who they are and where they're coming from, just in case you skipped any previous movies. Hawkeye is taken out of commission right away, so he doesn't really count. At this point in the franchise, he sat up in the tower during one scene in Thor, and at the beginning of this one, he's just camped out somewhere high up and does this over-the-top grapple slide down to the ground floor before disappearing for 2 hours. It sucks for his character, but considering there was so little for the audience to cling to even if they had seen his first appearance, it was probably the right choice to sideline him rather than trying to force us to care about his character alongside everyone and everything else that's going on. We first meet up with Natasha, who's tied up and being interrogated. Iron Man 2 completely ignored the Russian heritage of the character, so I respect Whedon for doing the comics justice and making that trait immediately placed as a focal point. This scene reaffirms how her looks disarm criminals while doing actual espionage work that properly matches her skill set. They also add in a layer of sass to an otherwise very flat character in Iron Man 2.
знаменитая черная вдова. Оказалось просто еще одно красивое личико.
Вы правда думаете, что я красива?
And finally, she kicks some major ass during this really cool chair fight. It's short, but the way she's leaping and springing around is among her best fight scenes. All of this shows her Black Widow-style tactics of using men's confidence and egos against them. In just a short few minutes, they've upgraded her as both a character and a hero, showing her in action, establishing some of her skills, giving her more of a personality, while also setting up her great scene with Loki later on. Although, it's maybe kinda stupid that she argues to stay on mission after her cover is clearly blown, with Coulson putting them in their place.
Ты слушай внимательно.
You're at 114 Selensky Plaza, 3rd floor. We have an F-22 exactly 8 miles out. Put the woman on the phone or I will blow up the block before you can make the lobby.
How was she supposed to carry on with this interrogation after that? Nat is summoned first, since she already works for S.H.I.E.L.D. and can then be used to gather up Banner. They could have had Fury, Maria, or Coulson gather every character, but I think it was really smart to create an excuse for characters to start pairing off, testing their personalities against one another, while also using her disarming nature to reach out to someone who is basically a time bomb.
But first, we need you to talk to the big guy.
Coulson, you know that Stark trusts me about as far as he can throw me.
Oh.
I've got Stark. You get the big guy.
We learn that Banner remains off the grid, isolating himself, yet he can't resist helping others. Bruce is a good person through and through and is risking the stress because he knows there's good he can do where he is. Ruffalo immediately brings a fidgety nervousness to the character that I absolutely adore. It's best seen when he's on his own on the helicarrier, but you can see it in this scene as well. And again, bringing this movie more closely in line with the comics than much of the rest of Phase 1, Hulk is immediately separated from Banner.
What if I say no?
I'll persuade you.
And what if the other guy says no?
Hulk isn't and has never been Angry Banner. I feel the Incredible Hulk movie never properly understood that. This movie wisely included an excuse for Bruce Banner to be needed, for his gamma radiation expertise, rather than them asking him directly to fight as Hulk. Again, it's a relief to see this movie respect Banner's intellect much more than his own origin film ever did. I love the gag of Banner slapping the table and yelling,
Talk to Fury. He needs you on this.
He needs me in a cage?
No one's gonna put you in.
Stop lying to me!
It brings a new layer to the character that Ruffalo nails, and helps this geeky oddball feel more at home alongside these other heroes. There's just a general awkwardness around this nerdy man. Give me more awkward, dorky heroes, please. While I do miss the darker, more terrifying side of the Hulk, I'm not sure it would have matched this movie well. This is instead now a Bruce who has learned to take himself less seriously, but is still aware of how the world perceives him and the Hulk. It also shows how petrified people are of the Hulk, even someone expertly trained and conditioned like Natasha. And it's a great reveal that she obviously wasn't going to come alone to gather him up. Cap is hanging out in an outdated gym, finding small ways to feel at home in these modern times. The music leading into his introduction stands out well above everything else so far, other than the literal Avengers theme stinger. This is one of the only times any of these movies address that he might not be handling the transition to this new time well. They make reference to him being out of place and out of time quite frequently, but we finally have a scene showing him as being somewhat unstable, angry, and fighting this internal conflict. It makes me wish they explored that on a deeper level, rather than it only ever being a joke about how out of place he is. However, another positive on immediate display here is the planning of this franchise and thoughtful positioning of these characters. Maybe it's It's easy to set things up when you're just playing around with a bunch of MacGuffins, but finding opportunities to tie in Bruce because of the gamma radiation and then bring Cap in, not just because he's a super soldier, but because he's one of only a few people with first-hand experience fighting against the Tesseract.
Is there anything you can tell us about the Tesseract that we ought to know now?
You should have left it in the ocean.
Continuing forward with the final one of these excellent mini-scenes, providing their quick, flashy, and super effective rapid characterizations, is rounded out with Tony. They wisely left him for last, knowing people would likely be most excited to see him. The whole sequence of introductions builds up through S.H.I.E.L.D., Clint, Natasha, Banner, Steve, and Tony, stair-stepping specifically based on character popularity. Iron Man's suit-up process is immediately the most advanced we've ever seen, disassembling naturally around him without even needing to break stride. This process is still rooted to a home base, but this is a hell of an upgrade. I feel like I have to mention every cool new way Tony's tech has leapt forward in each movie he's in, because the franchise absolutely nailed that aspect of his growth, progression, and ingenuity. He's not in a single MCU movie without showing some new way he's improved his suit-up procedure. I will say, however, his pseudo-future tech see-through phone just feels impractical. I'm glad that never caught on in real life. Tony's out here living the high life, making leaps forward in renewable energy, spending time with Pepper, and is so immediately and obviously the funniest character in the movie. Everyone cracks jokes, but none even come close to Tony.
Phil, come in.
Phil? I can't stay. His first name is Agent.
Even non-verbal moments easily get a laugh.
Well, then...
The mix of Whedon's quippy dialogue fits flawlessly with Robert Downey Jr.'s charisma and delivery. This guy is actually the smartest and coolest person in the room in every room he's ever in, so it makes total sense that he'd always have something quick and snappy to say. In general, there is a carefree breeziness around Stark that suits the character incredibly well. He's at his peak here, and it's actually the events of this movie that knock him off that podium. I'm a huge fan of how they've built him up only to shatter him and start his spiral down from this point all the way through to the next Avengers and beyond. This scene also shows how quickly and easily Tony's attention can be pulled away, that when there's a potential threat emerging, he seemingly can't ignore it. It's something that becomes a major hurdle in his relationship, despite this scene also showing us that at this point in time, him and Pepper have kind of found their rhythm. He's making time for her and trying to make his relationship a priority, but the second duty calls, his mind is immediately on the mission. The way they built that up over the years makes the eventual payoff in Endgame all the better. I can't say enough good things about this section of the movie. Moving one scene at a time to reintroduce these characters and assemble the team could so easily be the most boring part of the movie. Yet, each setup is succinct, captures the essence of the character, informs something important about where they're at in life and on their superhero journey, moving it all along at a brisk pace. Coulson gets pulled into the team, sharing some adorable scenes where he fanboys over Captain America, and while this line of his is maybe odd on its own,
When he's not that thing, though, guys like a Stephen Hawking. He's like a smart person.
it doesn't quite land as a quality punchline by itself, but it instead serves as a funny setup for a different payoff.
And I'd like to know how Loki used it to turn two of the sharpest men I know into his personal flying monkeys.
Monkeys? I do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
That initial line with Coulson is maybe one of the most hyper-Whedon-y inclusions in the entire script in kind of a bad way, yet I can't really hate on it because the secondary payoff of it is totally worth it. That's actually a great excuse to talk more specifically about the humor of this movie at large, before moving into the second act. As I said before, comedy is a shadow that has loomed over the franchise for many years now. Early on, it was accepted that Marvel was making family-friendly, joke-heavy movies. I don't think people took issue with that at the beginning, but around Thor Ragnarok, it began to be called into question whether every Marvel movie needed to share that jokey tone, with that style shift often being directly attributed to the Avengers. I've thought that was the case as well. Every Phase 1 movie was comedic, but in pretty simple, standard ways with the occasional one-liner and not much else. But this movie felt like it created a humor template that over 20 consecutive movies have now pulled from. And while yes, the jokes in this movie are extremely Whedon-esque, which may bother some people, I was surprised to see on a rewatch how effective and varied the humor in this movie really is. Looking only at examples from early on in this movie, they make a gag out of Steve being immediately nice to Banner and putting him at ease.
Word is you can find the cube.
Is that the only word on me?
Only word I care about.
Banner makes a joke about sticking the Hulk in a submerged, pressurized metal container, only to realize it's instead an aircraft.
No, this is much worse.
Nick Fury bet Steve Rogers $10 nothing would surprise him, and then they include a non-verbal moment of him paying up while he stares on in utter awe. Coulson and Steve end up standing together, with Coulson nerding out about his Captain America collectible cards.
It's a vintage set. Took me a couple of years to collect them all.
With the joke there being the context and the fact that we jumped in halfway through a conversation that was previously set up.
Did he ask you to sign his Captain America trading cards yet?
Trading cards.
They're vintage. He's very proud.
These are such simple examples strung together in rapid succession. They're not all going for big, gut-busting, laugh-out-loud moments. It's more about keeping things light and fun, yet they reflect meaningfully on the characters and inform their relationships, and often set up things further in the movie or act as foreshadowing. It's all incredibly purposeful. Honestly, I may never speak ill about the humor in this movie again. How it affected future MCU films is a matter to be determined in those individual reviews. And I can't forget about Tony, as Tony Stark is actually the only character in this movie who consistently weaves pop culture references and quips into all his dialogue.
Can you give me a lift?
Right. Better clench up, Legolas.
Even if he does pronounce it a little strangely. Other characters deliver this style of joke very rarely, but usually still in ways that are left to feel distinct from what he's bringing to the table. If you want to see everything that is Tony Stark distilled into one short scene, watch him arriving on the helicarrier shortly after detaining Loki. Tony saunters into the room, immediately controlling the scene. So already he's walking in mid-sentence giving relationship advice to Coulson.
So I'm just saying, pick a weekend. I'll fly you to Portland. She's love life.
Jumping then from teasing Thor,
no hard feelings, Point Break. You got a mean swing.
To using naval terms while they're in the air.
Raise the missing mast. Ship the topsails.
Calling out an employee for playing Galaga.
That man is playing Galaga. Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
And then trying to get into Fury's headspace with his eye patch.
How does Fury even see these?
He turns.
Sounds exhausting.
All of that plays out in like 20 seconds. It's so hilariously well written, and Downey Jr. just nails every syllable of it. He plants a device to hack S.H.I.E.L.D.'s computers, finds some common ground to talk jargon with Banner. All of this showing his wit and abrasiveness, but also that he has more to offer than his Iron Man suit. He has the bite to go with his bark. However, that expertise comes with tolerating his shit-disturbing attitude. Not only are the jokes varied among characters, but even within a single character like Tony, he's dancing between styles of humor at a breakneck clip. As a random aside, I heard an anecdote years ago that Downey Jr. hid snacks all over the set for himself, and the production eventually gave up trying to stop him. It's a funny behind-the-scenes detail, but also this unique quirk of the character. I guess he realized he had something very specific in common with Brad Pitt, which is the unlikely ability to make casually munching on snacks look cooler than smoking a cigarette. That first Iron Man movie very wisely took notice of Robert Downey Jr.'s strengths, and this movie continued on from that first, leveraging those qualities of the actor to great effect. Tony is the main vehicle for comedy in this movie. Everyone has their own funny moments with opportunities seized to give every character their own small gags and chuckles, but without the usual outlet of a blockbuster sidekick or comedic relief character in this heavy-hitting cast, they instead kinda reversed that formula. Maybe a lesser version of this script would have made someone like Coulson fill that role, but here it instead becomes the head of the group cracking jokes and keeping things light, rather than some minor character who had nothing else to contribute. It keeps the focus of the movie on the actual Avengers. Tony is a hyper, confident guy who is constantly running his mouth. So while he's delivering 100 jokes and quips a minute, dialing it up to 11, the jokes are otherwise sprinkled in more sparingly and with greater variety than I remembered. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of jokes and not a lot of serious moments, but man, they really did crush it with this, didn't they? This slap-happy joyride is a balance that wouldn't work in many other films, but I find it endlessly entertaining in this context. I wonder if it helps that Whedon was hired as a script doctor as well as a director, rather than being the original primary writer from the start. The first draft of this movie was instead written by Zach Penn. Script Doctor was Joss Whedon's main role in Hollywood for many years, famously punching up scripts like Toy Story back in the day. It may have helped him out here to have someone like Zach Penn write the first draft, to better distinguish each character's voice, which is a weakness of Whedon's. So allowing someone else to build the skeleton of what would become the Avengers, with Whedon then adding his own touches of comic book fandom and uniquely branded humor, may have helped rein in some of his poorer writing instincts. We do have a pretty convincing counterpoint to that, because Whedon joined production of Justice League late in the process, and that certainly didn't help anything. But my theory there is that he used his usual script punch-up prowess and silly style, and applied it to a film that was too dramatic in nature to properly leave room for constant joking around. Whereas his writing fit the Avengers like a glove and brought out some of his best work. Now, the second act is by no means boring. It's where plenty of the most interesting moments in the movie come from, finally having these heroes crammed together and forced to interact. It is, however, the period where we spend like an hour in this bland-ass helicarrier setting. I don't think the pace of the movie suffers during this portion, and they do find excuses to venture outside this airborne venue. It's just often visually lacking compared to the rest of the film. Mark Ruffalo did well in his first scene, stepping into a pre-established role, having to quickly communicate everything there is to know about Bruce Banner, finding his own voice in the role. Considering what a tall order that is, he probably benefited from The Incredible Hulk being the least seen MCU movie, while also having the Hulk be one of the most popular characters out of this group. He was in no way tethered to Norton's performance, only his backstory. And the second we see him confused and lost on the ship, fidgeting and pacing around, I was sold. From that moment on, I've never been able to picture Edward Norton carrying the character through this franchise the way Ruffalo has. So I feel like we really came out ahead on that one. I think Loki looks so suave and cool in his formal wear, but I suspect they positioned this iridium theft in Germany strictly to include this line from Captain America.
You know, the last time I was in Germany and saw a man standing above everybody else, we ended up disagreeing.
The soldier.
Loki's not gonna know what any of that means, Cap. Pretty inconsiderate for a guy who clearly has missing references as a bit of a sore spot. Anywho, Loki's eye-scanning device feels unnecessarily cruel and quite brutal, in a way that's fitting of a villain, and everyone very understandably runs in fear. People don't run in fear enough when shit goes down in superhero movies. His smirk, relishing the chaos, is great. Disrupting a party is something the god of mischief would love. It's one of only a few moments in this movie where Loki is most clearly enjoying himself on some level. He's on Earth for someone else, but Loki obviously still resents Earth on some level and is taking it out on the people. There's a fascinating layer of irony baked into this movie that only really reveals itself through the continuing story of the franchise. That Loki himself is here against his will, while claiming freedom is an illusion and that people crave subjugation. Are you maybe projecting there a wee little bit, Loki, my boy? It's like he's overcompensating and justifying to himself why it's okay to kneel and be ruled by someone else. Shout out to that hardcore old man who stands up to him. Iron Man drops in with a typical Stark level of flair. It's comical and completely in character to make such a show of his entrance. It's so satisfying when they include the wide shot of these two together for the very first time. It doesn't feel like much now, but remember 10 years ago, that alone was enough to have people bouncing in their seats. Immediately, Stark starts messing with Cap, and it's funny seeing him be fairly intolerant of that bullshittery. Now we're moving into a scene that is a personal favorite from the movie. Loki is the only one who knows to be concerned when the thunder starts out of nowhere, anticipating Thor's arrival, and with no explanation, he quickly and easily swoops in and yoinks Loki away.
We need a plan of attack!
I have a plan. Attack.
That is an instance where Whedon dialogue manages to come around full circle, eclipsing its own cheesiness and becoming badass. But what's this? Steve is jumping out of the plane with a parachute? What a pussy, am I right? When Thor arrives, his demeanor is carrying straight over from his first movie, still delivering a more formal god portrayal, with that more Shakespearean dialogue and delivery in tow.
You have no idea what you're dealing with.
Shakespeare in the Park? Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?
I really like the way this first movie sets him apart from the group. It's an interesting progression that the more time he spends around humans, the less he talks like this, but I'm glad we had at least one movie where he's totally at odds with the team, because the entire point is what an oddball collective they all make. They acknowledge that Odin is not Loki's father, and they play it up to great effect later on.
And he's my brother.
He killed 80 people in 2 days.
He's adopted.
It's such a small moment, but it really does communicate just how honed Hemsworth's comedic chops are. That he was really underutilized early on, especially in these first two Avengers movies. So yes, they address Loki as adopted, but they completely skirt around the whole frost giant thing. It's wild how hard and how quickly this franchise ditched that plot point. I like the idea that even though Thor has shown he isn't fully ready for the throne, he is building a strong personal grasp on what leadership entails.
I mean to rule them.
Why should I not? You think yourself above them.
Oh, yes.
Then you miss the truth of ruling, brother. The throne would suit you ill.
All of that is great, but the highlight I actually meant to draw attention to before I went on 1,000 tangents is the big matchup of Thor and Iron Man. If you've actually watched all my reviews so far, first off, thank you. That means a lot. That's really awesome. I know it's a lot of hours of content to watch. And second, you know what a sucker I am for creating excuses for these superheroes to test their might against one another. I'm even pretty forgiving of when these matchups feel a little more contrived. Luckily, it makes more sense in this movie compared to almost any other. They don't know or trust each other, he came hurtling out of nowhere, and it immediately comes to blows. Starting right from their pre-fight banter, this is one of the all-time best hero versus hero fights in a movie.
Do not touch me again.
Then don't take my stuff.
Realistically, Thor should be able to crush Iron Man in about 2 seconds. His tech is nowhere near refined enough to sustain a full swing from Mjolnir, and Thor is a near invincible god. So I instead point to a relatively famous Stan Lee quote. Anytime anybody asks you who would win in a fight, the only correct answer is,
The person who'd win in a fight is the person that the scriptwriter wants to win.
It's a plot convenience for these two to be equally matched, and I'm okay with that. Say Thor is pulling his swings, or that Iron Man's suit has the structural engineering to sustain that kind of damage. Say whatever you need to. I personally see no need for those mental gymnastics attempting to root a man wearing a suit of metal versus the Norse god of thunder anywhere in reality. Not while this awesomeness is going on in front of me. The fight is loaded with fantastic moments. Thor supercharging Tony's suit, him rocket boosting away from the hammer and turning that around into a thrusted punch. Ending it off with Thor hitting Mjolnir against Cap's shield is just so cool to see. People like to compare and square off iconic superhero tools and weapons as often as the heroes themselves. I think us super nerds are still waiting for the day we get to see an adamantium v vibranium matchup on the big screen. It took about 50 minutes, but at this point, the Avengers are now officially assembled. They are far from being a functioning team, but they've now all been brought together. The pacing thus far has been phenomenal. We've had loads of one-on-one character pairings already, having them size each other up, with plenty of tension and friction among the team. Beyond that, our main threat has been firmly established, and the simple goal of retrieving the Tesseract, while being quite MacGuffin heavy, is straight and clear. It's an incredibly simple plot, but there's too much else going on to worry about anything more complex than this. There's really not a lot to dislike thus far. We've been slowly pulling these characters into orbit with passing interactions and matchups. Now we enter the most delightful period of the movie, where all these big personalities are mixed up in a heated cocktail of showboating, bickering, vying for leadership, and slowly allowing them to test each other's limits. Tony is the cock of the walk, trying to out-charisma everyone else. Thor knows he's a god walking among mortals. Cap wants things to be orderly and civilized. Bruce is nervous around others and is struggling to find his place as just a scientist in this mix, while characters like Fury, Natasha, and Coulson represent the regular humans, trying to navigate and somehow stay afloat in these shark-infested waters. Clint is on the human list too, but isn't really a part of this movie. One thing with these big event films is that the only real character development is instead in how the Avengers team grows and changes together, rather than individual characters experiencing meaningful arcs. There are teeny tiny bits of character development happening, like Tony learning there aren't always shortcuts, and that you sometimes require the sacrifice play. But the focus is mainly on the team, the villain, and whatever big things need to be stopped or overcome. There's no good way to give 6+ character arcs while still keeping things entertaining and progressing the plot. I'm totally fine with that, and don't hold it against these movies, unless they actively botch an attempted or forced arc or unjustly regress a character. Luckily, this movie avoids any of those issues. This movie never pauses for deep, serious moments of reflection. It's more like passing glances of intensity.
I got low. I didn't see an end, so I put a bullet in my mouth and the other guy spit it out.
I'm honestly quite surprised they made that deleted scene of his attempted suicide canon. As someone pointed out in my Incredible Hulk video comments, apparently tie-in comics to the MCU explained that that event is what unearthed Steve Rogers' frozen body. How neat is that? But it's not even the only nod back to the Incredible Hulk.
Thanks, but the last time I was in New York, I kind of broke Harlem.
It wasn't the strongest movie, and it's a little jarring with the recasting, but I'm glad they didn't completely ignore those events. Also, Tony is such a shit disturber.
No surprises.
Ow!
Hey! Nothing?
Are you nuts?
Maybe Tony doesn't understand what he's dealing with, but I really like the recurring thread in this movie that he's the only one not afraid of Hulk. And when I say only one, that kind of includes Bruce.
You're tiptoeing, big man.
You need to strut.
He wants to witness Hulk firsthand, and in his own obnoxious way seems very encouraging and accepting of Banner.
It's good to meet you, Dr. Banner. Your work on anti-electron collisions is unparalleled, and I'm a huge fan of the way you lose control and turn into an enormous green rage monster.
Thanks.
Really, Tony is out here riling everyone up? It goes back to the end of Iron Man 2.
It's Agent Romanoff's assessment of you. Read it.
Personality overview. Mr. Stark displays compulsive behavior, prone to self-destructive tendencies. I was dying. Textbook narcissism. Tony Stark not recommended? That doesn't make any sense.
This is exactly the reason he earned that assessment. It's not all teasing, as he may actually grant Bruce a new perspective on the Hulk. Tony explains that his own arc reactor is a physical part of him. It saved his life and made him who he is today.
So you're saying that the Hulk, the other guy, saved my life? That's nice. It's a nice sentiment. Saved it for what?
I guess we'll find out.
I kinda love their relationship. They share a passion for the science and bond over that. But they also include this characterization of Banner as a fearful loner, and it takes the persistence of the most arrogant and pushy man on the planet to potentially help him see the value in his curse. This movie kinda makes me wish they had made a Tony and Bruce movie along the way. They'd probably have to call it Iron Man 4 or, I don't know, The Science Boys to avoid distribution issues with Universal. But they could have had them being a couple of nerdy bros together exploring early attempts at Ultron or attempting to cure Banner of the Hulk together. And while I think his connection with Banner is better and more well handled in this movie than it potentially ever is again, nothing really compares to the dynamic between Tony and Steve. As soon as they're in a room together, Tony immediately resents Steve because Howard, his father, always talked so highly of him, while Steve feels Tony doesn't live up to the man he knew.
Following's not really my style.
You're all about style, aren't you?
Even more than that, Steve is trying to maintain order and follow the rules, while Tony is actively hacking S.H.I.E.L.D. Next thing, Cap is doing his usual maneuver of going on a solo mission to get results. And it's quite hilarious that he shows up Tony by manually returning with an answer more quickly than he can. And, as an incredible side note, I loved the through line that after the events of Winter Soldier, Ultron, up to Civil War, Tony and Steve undergo major yet logical perspective flips on heroic regulations. I praised that in depth in my Civil War review, but it deserves another tip of the hat for how well realized their conflicting personalities were right from the beginning, and how they grew and changed together. And on some level, they were each successful enough to win the other over to their side. Then, off in the corner, we have Thor. He really has the least to say and do in this movie. I mean, other than Hawkeye, of course. Apparently, Zach Penn originally downplayed his role even further, thinking he wouldn't work on film. It was only after Hemsworth was cast, and with further script contributions from Whedon, that he was really brought back into the fold.
No hard feelings, Point Break. You got a mean swing.
But come on, Thor has less screen time than Nick Fury in this movie. At least they dedicated one line to where Jane is, and Eric Selvig is a pretty major part of the plot, but it all really adds up to him not being paid a lot of mind in this movie. I'm pretty iffy on the whole concept of Loki being willfully captured.
Loki is a prisoner. And why do I feel like he's the only person on this boat that wants to be here?
As a plot point, it's mostly used well in this movie, but it was also done in The Dark Knight in 2008 and again in Skyfall, also coming out in 2012. These weren't the first 3 movies to do it, but it suddenly became a far overused trope in every blockbuster. Like it was somehow the only tactic that villains ever seemed to employ. It at least makes sense in this movie that he maybe needed to be near the scepter in order to properly use it to manipulate everyone. They're all vaguely aware he's up to something, but aren't quite sure what. And while I'm sure a 30,000-foot drop would hurt Loki, it doesn't hold up as that great of a threat when leveraged against a supposed god.
You get how that works? Ant. Boot.
Okay, I do really enjoy the payoff of that earlier exchange. Loki's capture leads into a scene I've always been a little torn on. I will say I think it's much more good than bad, I just have one kind of small nitpick. It starts off with a beat that is an equally great character moment for both Loki and Natasha.
There's not many people who can sneak up on me.
God, Hiddleston is so good at these sly little smirks. As the scene winds up, the shot of him approaching her reflected through the glass as he cuts deeply, taunting her.
I won't touch Barton, not until I make him kill you. Slowly, intimately, in every way he knows you fear.
I love the visual, and the delivery on the last part of that speech is the most twisted and outright villainous the character has ever been. It's fantastic. And kudos to Whedon for finding a way to slip in Loki calling Nat a whining pussy in a PG-13 movie.
This is my bargain, you mewling quim.
It's a solid reveal and great mirror to her introductory scene that the Widow has again lured someone into her trap, outfoxing the God of Mischief. Her whole thing is to have him feel like he's winning the exchange and tormenting her, leading to him bragging and tipping his hand. My one gripe is that it feels like an absurd leap in logic from him saying the word monster to her knowing he's trying to unleash the Hulk. It technically makes sense, like, I can follow it, but it's just shy of fully sticking the landing for me.
You're a monster.
Oh no. You brought the monster.
It's a tough one to analyze because I've disliked that moment in my brain for 10 years, and on this rewatch, it didn't bother me nearly as much as it did any other time. So it's a weak criticism, not gonna die on that hill. While we're talking Nat, Whedon did an excellent job at fleshing her out in this movie. It's easy to forget that before this, she was just a super minor role in Iron Man 2, existing solely as eye candy. Here, she lures in and pummels a bunch of Russian mobsters, outsmarts Loki, shakes off a run-in with the Hulk, hijacks an alien racing pod, and figures out how to close the portal during the big battle. She feels as heroic as everyone else and was given room in the script to feel like an actual person, properly making use of Johansson as an actress. In Age of Ultron, not so much. But we'll get into that later. When the scepter is in full effect, wriggling into the minds of our heroes, we have this great scene where everyone is piling on and becoming increasingly frustrated. They're actually throwing around a lot of good points, and the scene flows really well despite everyone talking on top of one another. I really like this little bit of camera work where it inverts to position the scepter in the center. Even better than that is probably the final moment revealing that Banner had unknowingly picked it up. And my favorite part of this whole exchange is the idea that S.H.I.E.L.D. is pursuing Tesseract-based weaponry thanks to Thor.
We learned that not only are we not alone, but we are hopelessly, hilariously outgunned.
The knowledge that aliens and gods are real and that Earth is outmatched is a great in-universe reason for that escalation. The one part of it I dislike is that Tony attempts to argue against a nuclear deterrent strategy. That was like your whole deal in Iron Man 2, dude. You basically claimed that you had personally achieved world peace thanks to you specifically being a living deterrent. Maybe it's supposed to be that he learned a lesson through that movie, realizing that what he instead created was an invitation for a whole new form of arms race. But it certainly never felt that way, because the movie ends with him kicking ass and winning anyways. If this growth or change in his character was intended to be a takeaway of that movie, it's yet another knock against Iron Man 2 that I never covered in my review of that movie. We can attempt to fill in that between movie revelation as some sort of headcanon without the need to fully spell it out.
You forced our hand. We had to come up with
a nuclear deterrent, because that always calms everything right down.
But instead, they could have easily tweaked that line to something like, I was the deterrent. I don't think the bad guys need that encouragement. Not as clean of writing as the rest of the movie, I'm no screenwriter, but it's a slight change I'd have appreciated to better bridge those two movies. And the best part of this scene is, of course, when Tony and Steve are pushed into a heated face-to-face.
Put on the suit. Let's go a few rounds.
These two characters are essentially always the best thing in the franchise, especially when they play off one another, revealing equal amounts about both characters.
You're not going alone.
You gonna stop me?
Put on the suit. Let's find out. I'm not afraid to hit an old man. Put on the suit.
I really don't know how this franchise will ever recapture the magic of this perfect pairing. And as a clever way to wrap up this interaction that you can't help but grin at once the attack begins.
Put on the suit. Yep.
After spending that time bringing everyone together, we've now juggled all these characters, showing that you can't just throw them all into a box and call them a team. They argue and disagree constantly, but the second a threat emerges, their inner heroes all come out and immediately spring into action, working together where needed. It's so satisfying to see. Of course, it's not all smooth sailing, as Loki's plan of bringing out the Hulk absolutely works, and creates a huge hurdle for the team and another excuse for them to fight one another. In my Hulk review, I criticized the MCU for not making strong use of the Hulk as a true menace. When I made that claim, I was picturing the end of this movie and some early and late scenes in Ultron. In reality, after watching these movies again, Whedon did a pretty damn good job of showing how dangerous the Hulk can be. In both movies, there is a dedicated scene to him absolutely wrecking everything, including attacking his own team, despite the increasing levels of control Bruce has achieved. Bruce is basically a side character in this movie, and is actively avoiding the Hulk the entire time, yet manages to have more cool Hulk moments than in his own solo movie. Maybe that's because Bruce can be quite boring on his own, acting as a loner and trying to avoid conflict, while in this team-up he can interact with other characters and do more than just run from the government. And when he does do a big rage, they can really focus in on him, so while it's a shame he doesn't feel like he gets his due, I do think he was used the appropriate amount in this movie. But his overall back row positioning is bound to be a sore spot for mega fans of the character. There are a few great moments for Banner and the Hulk, even before the obvious ones during that big final battle. I like when the Hulk is first coming out, where he looks back over his shoulder twice. The first time, we see Bruce's own panicked eyes, and the second time, it's all Hulk. It's amazing seeing him barrel through things in this unstoppable manner. That's a great visual. It makes sense to have Thor and Hulk go toe-to-toe as they match up the closest, featuring awesome moments like Hulk getting slow-mo uppercut. Also, sick power slide there, Thor. Or Hulk putting all his strength into trying to lift this tiny little hammer. They even pay off this matchup later on during the Battle of New York. Hulk is all worked up and can't control himself, clearly has some leftover rage from that matchup, and gets in a huge sucker punch. cracks me up every time and shows that even with Banner seemingly working directly with Hulk here, he's still a wild card. One of the best Hulk scenes is when he attacks the jet that was sent in to distract him. The pilot's oh shit face as he sees this big green monster flying at him is perfect. The cherry on top is Hulk grabbing the seat as it ejects, only to throw it like a softball immediately after, before himself getting blown like a million miles away. His energy and aggression is all about reaction. There's no planning when this guy gets in a fight. There were very few other ways jumping at that jet could have gone. And I love that the Hulk is so angry that his own safety isn't remotely a consideration. The only thing he knew is that he had to attack that jet. Back on the ship, Natasha is clearly rattled to the bone, which is great to see. That's the appropriate reaction. Despite all her training, nothing prepares you for a run-in with that. But she's a pro, shakes it off, and gets back into the action. Her fight with Barton is fine, it's mostly just some tame grappling. It's always weird seeing someone try to use a bow as a hand-to-hand weapon, but I do enjoy that she was willing to bite him, whatever it takes to get an edge, I suppose. Loki tricks Thor, and I love that he immediately calls out his brother for being so gullible.
Are you ever not going to fall for that?
But the best part of this is Coulson standing up to Loki, using a version of Asgard's own destroyer tech no less.
Even I don't know what it does. Want to find out?
As a side note, it's another great example of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s MO. If they see an opportunity to get a leg up in this universe-wide arms race, they're going to take it. Honestly, it feels quite true to the real-world government. No stretch of the imagination there. Clark Gregg was charming as hell and so instantly likable in these movies. And after seeing him become friends with most of these characters leading up to the Avengers, his death is actually pretty devastating. At least he goes out like a badass.
I don't think
So that's what it does.
Honestly, hearing that he was coming back for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was the main reason I started that show. Maybe someday I'll go back and watch the rest of it. All of this going on leaves Cap and Tony forced to pair off and work together. I mean, Steve kind of contributes notably less to this effort than Tony, but at least they're starting to find their rhythm.
What's it look like in there?
It seems to run on some form of electricity.
Well, you're not wrong.
There's no bickering or condescension here. They need to get on the same page and set all squabbling or personal beef aside. One thing that bothers me a bit here is who the hell is Cap fighting? He's shooting people, tossing them off the ship, and blowing them to bits. Loki didn't bring a human army or have one waiting on Earth for him, so these are likely all mind-controlled soldiers, many of which probably came from S.H.I.E.L.D. Yet they're being killed and discarded willy-nilly. It could have made this fight so much more interesting and in line with Steve's morals if he somehow had to stall this threat and protect Tony while trying desperately to not kill anyone in the process. Then maybe he'd have more to do than camping out this one spot, shooting a gun at this one doorway. These could maybe be Hydra agents, as they might be fighting here even without mind control. But at this point, from Cap's perspective, with that reveal having not taken place, these are essentially his co-workers that he's blowing away. So that bothers me a little bit. Thor gets dropped, and it's pretty tense seeing him try to get his bearings and escape before the crash. Seeing this thing in action, maybe it could have crushed a god. I still have some trouble believing that. I think the worst part of this is that Loki just leaves on a jet suddenly. He's caused some damage, released the Hulk, and dropped a man who's capable of flying out of the ship, and then called his work done. Why not blast a massive hole in the carrier? His plan was to put a rift in the team, which he does. But why not just finish the job now, or take away this valuable resource of the aircraft? The team was split up and put on the ropes, but there was no reason to let them off easy at this point. You're just trying to make some sporting good fun out of it? Like, what the hell? I mentioned early on that I think the directing of Fury's speech is fine. Like the shot of the cards being thrown across the glass table. I think that's pretty effective. But there's kind of a larger issue here. Steve is the only one in the room who wouldn't already know all this. Meanwhile, Thor, Banner, Clint, and Natasha never even get this rallying speech. Maybe it does the trick and works as intended, as Fury knew that if he convinced Tony and Steve, the rest would follow, but it's maybe a little too clear that Fury is giving this speech to the audience. We then have yet another fantastic scene between these two, with Steve trying to comfort Tony.
Is this the first time you lost a soldier?
We are not soldiers.
The idea of losing anyone to collateral damage doesn't sit right with Tony. He has this baggage of being an arms dealer. He no longer wants to in any way cost the lives of anyone innocent. It's this refusal to accept that I think worms its way into his mind and comes to torment him, leading all the way up to Civil War when he has to face this more head on. It's important for Tony to learn he can't brush everything away or solve it all with a new piece of tech. There are likely to be casualties in the process. And it shows Steve growing into the role of leader, and he's able to be there for someone like Tony, even though he is both Steve's senior and would never ask for help. Seriously, every time these two are on screen together, it's just excellent. And we're now moving into the thrilling third act. After 5 films of these heroes facing off against lesser mirrors of themselves, the super boring trope of, Iron Man fighting Steel Man, or Super Soldier Cap fighting Super Soldier Skull. It's played out. These third acts also typically wrap up quite quickly, while this movie decided to go full force. I was actually quite worried that this big battle wouldn't hold up, because we've seen heroes fighting hordes of generic aliens multiple times at this point. But they wisely pull the focus off the army only, splitting the mission up and giving our heroes plenty to do, while also trying to square off against Loki and close the portal. It's all quite standard fare, but it keeps everyone busy and gives us 100 small moments to gawk at. So I see nothing wrong with that. It's like the superhero movie equivalent of the big Lord of the Rings battles. Not necessarily in terms of scope or execution, the goals and end results are totally different, but to have all our leads coming together and holding their ground to fight endless hordes of enemies, turning a big final battle into an epic sequence of pure entertainment, reveling in that chaos filled with excellent moments. They knew that making this climax as much of a spectacle as possible and making sure not to rush any of it would make it feel worth the buildup. Fighting a horde of aliens is now something these movies have done maybe a few too many times, but it was fresh and new back in 2012. It lives up to exactly what it needed to be for this movie, and some excellent directing, like during that insane oneer, zooming between every hero, it all elevates an otherwise cookie-cutter finale. And the more it whizzes through their fighting, the more things continue to escalate. And that already brilliant oneer sequence is capped off with the iconic team circle shot, which includes the excellent Avengers theme song. I think that is seared into everyone's brain and is the first image that pops into anyone's mind when they think back to this movie. Again, I know the way things are lit and composited isn't the most exciting thing in this movie. It doesn't carry a lot of drama. But I don't know how anyone can watch this sequence and then claim the CGI in this movie is bad with a straight face. Obviously, there's a lot of green screen going on here. There was literally no other way to do it. I think it looks mostly seamless, and I feel like you would have to choose to take yourself out of the movie to critique and dissect it, rather than any clunky visuals being at fault for taking you out of that experience. Large chunks of this movie, especially the final battle, have been uploaded to YouTube in 60 frames per second, and yes, those look awful. But that's because 60 frames per second always looks awful. I hate it. It was terrible when The Hobbit came to theaters with a high frame rate, and it looks like crap on every smart TV that attempts to interpolate the frames and bring it up to some enhanced frame rate. I don't know why anyone even bothers with that. It never looks like anything other than absolute dog shit. If that's what people are pointing towards, then I don't know what to tell you. That's not how the movie was meant to be seen. Everyone suiting up and getting ready for this big showdown is hardcore. The team has slowly been taking shape throughout the movie, but now it's time for the Avengers to actually assemble. The amount of damage the Chitauri do is insane. Far, far greater than I remembered. Like 5 seconds in, they've already leveled city blocks and destroyed entire buildings. Holy shit. Tony's suit has sustained a lot of damage. Seeing him use his disassembly walkway as an excuse to stare down Loki is great. It's such a baller move to shed his protection during this intimidation. I feel his whole threatening speech just fully lands. And after getting straight up yeeted, Tony's prototype of a self-assembling suit makes an outstanding debut. It's pretty awesome that the epilogue to this movie, being Iron Man 3, starts off with Tony improving that specific suit advancement. Meanwhile, Cap takes charge and emerges as the de facto leader. His best moment in this movie is probably when he gives orders to the police, gets blown off, saves them all by kicking alien ass, and turning around for everyone to immediately execute his plan.
I need men in those buildings. Lead the people down and away from the streets. You got it. We're gonna set up a perimeter all the way down to 39th Street.
I also love when he ducks into a little ball behind his shield to absorb an explosion. But obviously that doesn't fully protect him from getting totally blown away. Everyone is really getting knocked around here. Look at Tony bursting out of the big flying worm alien. It's great to see these heroes struggling and taking major hits throughout. It's funny coming back to this movie and seeing how underpowered Thor feels. He's obviously insanely capable, crushing Chitauri left and right, chucking entire cars, but he's barely making any use of his actual powers. I guess they didn't want it to feel too much like he could solve this invasion all on his own. I think it's cool as heck the way Hawkeye selects his trick arrows. Seeing that take place in his control, with the final selection occurring within the quiver, makes a lot more sense than him just randomly grabbing the tool he needs for any given job. You just have to put it out of mind that he'd be useless within like 3 minutes when he inevitably ran out of arrows. I'm willing to overlook that, otherwise he would be too lame to handle. He's already flirting with that line here. Everyone in this movie gets at least one exceedingly badass moment. Hawkeye jumping off the roof, spinning around, and shooting the grapple arrow up behind him was probably the moment where everyone felt, okay, maybe this guy has a place on the team. 10 years later, they even made that exact moment into an important plot point of the Hawkeye show, which was a really great payoff to see an in-world character appreciate those heroics as much as I did when first seeing it in theaters. If it can wow us, then yeah, it would blow the mind of any person who saw that happen in real life. I talked about it before, but Natasha seriously pulls her weight, despite pretty well just shooting pistols. She's flipping around, kicking ass, and even hijacks one of these alien racers. And while the Hulk already had a few great moments in this movie, his best moment is quite possibly the best moment in a movie that is entirely packed with fan service, cool moments, and epic quotable one-liners.
That's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry.
Seeing this movie again, all these years later, that still gave me chills. I live for big payoffs like that in these movies.
And Hulk. Smash.
Also incredible, and the way he starts flinging himself around the city, wrecking absolutely everything, is much closer to how I wanted to see the character move and get around in his solo outing. Outside of the main Avengers, I like how they found some space for Fury in this climax, even though he's separated from the actual fight. I'm generally a big fan of how they've allowed Samuel L. Jackson to bring so much of himself to the role of Nick Fury.
Navigation's recalibrating after the engine failure.
Is the sun coming up?
Yes, sir.
Then put it on the left.
It was an unexpected but very successful choice to take one of our most recognizable actors and allow him to live in the role in a way that couldn't really be ignored. It'd be so easy to go with a general authoritarian casting and allow that character to recede into the background. The worst example of that is probably Joel Kinnaman as Rick Flag in Suicide Squad, the first one at least, and I feel like something like that would have been the obvious choice for this character. Everything that is great about Fury in these movies works because it's already something that is great about Samuel L. Jackson.
Director Fury, the Council has made a decision.
I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it.
It feels like a clever little hack to elevate the character, make the role distinct, and keep him engaging across the whole franchise. I'm glad that they clearly favor casting the right person for a role over exclusively chasing these high-profile names. And with Samuel L. as Nick Fury, we were lucky enough to get both. Something I learned much later is that Marvel had to use Samuel L. Quoting Mark Miller, who originally changed the character to look like this, "Sam is famously the coolest man alive, and both myself and artist Brian Hitch just liberally used him without asking any kind of permission. You have to remember this was 2001 when we were putting this together. The idea that this might become a movie seemed preposterous, as Marvel was just climbing out of bankruptcy at the time. Jackson is an occasional comic reader and absolutely took notice of his likeness suddenly appearing in this comic. But rather than suing Marvel, he struck a deal. If Nick Fury ever appeared in a live-action movie, he had right of first refusal on the part. That unprecedented deal ended up as a real win-win-win, didn't it? Funny how that almost ended up being a better deal for Marvel than it did to Samuel L. Immediately locking him down for a 9-movie contract? That's wild. As the fighting is wrapping up, we have this great little roller coaster of Hawkeye taking his shot at Loki. We then both get to be deflated and elated with him catching it with that cocky little smirk again, only for it to blow up anyways. I just love how quickly it swings back and forth between who won that matchup. I have to imagine this wasn't the first movie to include the trope subversion of interrupting the villain's big speech of evil gloating. Kudos if it was the first, because nobody has really done it better. I've seen it a few times since, but nothing can really compare to Hulk smashing a god around like a rag doll.
Puny god.
That moment is among the best audience reactions I've ever seen in a theater. It was a great idea to have the government then attempt to nuke Manhattan. That's absolutely insane, but it's not hard to follow how things escalated so quickly. And it adds a ticking clock for our heroes on top of everything else working against this team. It's crushing to have Tony make his final call to Pepper only for her to miss that goodbye. And in general, it's a perfect character moment for Tony to be the one to make the sacrifice play after he and Cap specifically argued over that.
You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play. To lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
I think I would just cut the wire.
Everyone's emergency response to Tony falling back to Earth is a little lacking. Does anybody here want to check his pulse or anything? Maybe see if he's breathing? Thank you, Hulk, for doing something. Jeez. There's this wrap-up sort of montage of people being interviewed. It's simple, but it's good to see regular people react to the idea of a superhero team emerging to protect Earth. Small moments like this guy getting his beard styled like Tony, or the Hulk now being seen publicly as a hero. And to close it all out, the A being the only letter left on Stark's building after all this is corny, but I think that's exactly why I like it. The end credits are just these 3D modeled statues. It's kind of neat to get close-ups of all their gear and stuff, but I think it's a little underwhelming. It's wild how far CGI has come in this time. Their quick tease of Thanos looks fine, but it's nothing compared to what they eventually achieved. I remember having to immediately Google who the heck was that in the credits of this movie, and the realization that they were planning that far ahead was so satisfying. At the time, along with most other people, I didn't have any familiarity with Thanos, so the line in this scene was lost on me.
To challenge them is to court death.
In the comics, Thanos falls in love with the physical embodiment of death, and snaps half of everyone out of existence as a love letter to this Mistress Death. I do have to wonder if back at this time, that was the reasoning they intended to give, or if that line was only ever meant to be a wink at the comics. While such a goofy post-credit scene might annoy some viewers, I think it's hilarious. After spending all that time building up the idea of cool teases in these post-credit scenes, it was so good to hear a collective groan from the audience mixed with plenty of chuckles. To this day, I still love when they turn these post-credit scenes into gags rather than the next big setup. They have 100 things in the works at all times, and sometimes I prefer a silly throwaway moment that lets me ruminate on the movie I just watched, rather than immediately trying to shift my attention to the next big thing. Based on how things have been going with Phase 4, these movies could benefit from spending a bit less time tripping over themselves with setups. Most of the last points I want to share are quicker than the usual bullet point throwaway. Also, Sam Almond on my Captain America trilogy video suggested calling this section of these reviews the leftovers, two left thumbs, and I thought that was perfect. Feel free to pitch other suggestions, but for now, that's the title. So cheers, Sam. So, leftovers for the Avengers. For starters, we need to talk about Cap's suit. There's not much to say about anybody else's. They all look good and basically the same as the movie they were most recently in, but none stick out nearly as poorly as this flat blue, cheap Halloween store knockoff suit. I personally like the simple argument Coulson gives for keeping the old-fashioned Stars and Stripes costume.
Everything that's happening, the things that are about to come to light, people might just need a little old-fashioned.
It's cheesy, but they're paying its absurdity some mind without making a joke out of it, which is appreciated. They moved so quickly away from this style of costume, using it only for his big celebratory mascot phase, that it's kind of fun to see him trying to fight in something more similar to that. On paper, the flashy colors are great and stand out in a bright and eye-grabbing way. My main issue is how garbage his helmet looks. Shout out to the random Chitauri that knocks this crappy thing off, because it looks way better after that. I almost have no issue with this version of the costume from this point on. However, there isn't a ton of definition to the suit, so it risks flattening out his silhouette a little too much. And while it's far from my favorite Captain America suit, I do think it fit the pulpy cartoon vibe Whedon was going for. So it's not great, but I don't hate it anywhere near as much as people usually seem to. While talking designs, I'm a little torn on this new Hulk. I think I mostly prefer it. He's nowhere near as lean as the original version, which means we don't see nearly as many cords of muscle rippling beneath his green skin. I really liked that aspect of the 2008 Hulk movie. It's still a little present, but this more cartoonishly proportioned Hulk does look and feel a lot heavier and more threatening. I even like the way they give Hulk a distinct posture and way of carrying himself. It borders on ape-like, which I think fits incredibly well. And one more leftover talking point is that I generally enjoy them avoiding the trope of heroes losing their powers. Everyone gets knocked around and separated, but they all remain fully capable. It's smart to have everyone fighting at their full power and struggling in spite of that. We can save those personal hurdles for solo outings. This movie is entirely about becoming the goddamn Avengers. Having a fight against Earth's mightiest heroes wouldn't work as well if anyone was working with half their usual abilities. It's the best Loki and the Chitauri had versus the best Earth had, and it's a delight to watch them kick so much ass. I just deeply appreciate that they let us have that in our very first team-up event film. It's absolutely wild that there was a point in time where the Avengers felt like the end point this was all building up to. We really had no idea. Fans obviously hoped that there was more to come, but 6 movies was already a lot by the standard of most franchises. This was the movie that cemented Marvel as pop culture titans that couldn't be ignored. It was a while longer before they entered their can do no wrong phase when they started introducing more and more ridiculous characters. But there's a fun parallel here, with a big part of the movie being Fury trying to prove to the world that the Avengers initiative is a good idea, while this movie is attempting to do the very same with the general audience. It all serves as an exceptional juggling act, making the ultimate film for comic book fans and Marvel enthusiasts, while making what was undeniably the blockbuster event that was fun for all ages and demographics, regardless of if you knew anything before going into this movie. It's kind of a relief to learn the Avengers remains as fun, funny, action-packed, engaging, and cheer-worthy 10 years later. I assumed I would find plenty to complain about and things that didn't hold up, but my critiques basically all boiled down to some visual choices. And I don't even think the aspect ratio and lighting are inherently bad. And the film was made with this so clearly in mind and taken full advantage of. There are fan edits out there that attempt to regrade the film and go with a smaller aspect ratio. Obviously, that's never going to work perfectly because you're working with something that was already filmed rather than the initial filming being made with this style in mind. But based on this alone, it makes things feel too dark, shifts the tone in a direction this movie wasn't going for, and fails to show the full action as intended. So I certainly don't consider any of that a major issue. With any other complaint I had being incredibly minor and nitpicky, I am comfortable in confidently scoring this one as a 9 out of 10. It's damn near perfect and was exactly what we all wanted and the franchise needed. When creating a pre-watch ranking, I just assumed this movie wouldn't really hold up nearly as well as it existed in my mind, and I found it to be better than I remembered. So an end score of 9 actually puts it at the very top of my ranking so far. Not bad, Marvel. Not bad. Since this video was so long, I thought about doing multiple interludes, but I like the idea of balancing it out as one interlude per movie. So let's take a quick break to celebrate another landmark bit of filmmaking. Robert Downey Jr. himself has said some of his best work as an actor exists in the MCU, and I don't disagree. As I've said before, he's outstanding in Civil War. The weight and emotion he's brought to these movies elevated the entire genre, and it's wild to think they ever considered making a version of Civil War without him. That's just impossible to imagine now. And after finally taking home his first Oscar this week, I wanted to hype up a previous Academy nomination of Downey's, Tropic Thunder. The Academy is so often chasing dramas and biopics. If you have a big crying or yelling scene or can imitate someone real and famous, you're far more likely to be nominated than in almost any comedic role. Because of that, I'm always fascinated by performances that are so transcendentally funny that the Academy has to stop and tip their hat to it. As someone who grew up with this movie, it's been such a wild thing to watch this performance take heat in the last decade for the blackface. Bet you didn't think I was gonna defend blackface in this video, but the entire role and its jokes are rooted in a method actor taking things too far. The blackface isn't done at the expense of black performers, but rather it's riffing on entitled actors and phony Hollywood, while also commentating on white actors taking roles clearly meant for black actors.
Because they had one good part in for a black man, they gave it to Crocodile Dundee.
Pump your brakes, kid. That man's a national treasure.
Not only was this movie ahead of its time and clever in how it tackles that particular subject matter, it's just end-to-end funny. Ben Stiller and Jack Black are in their prime, the writing and action are all around great, the supporting cast is stacked, the intro gag of having fake movie trailers is an all-timer.
5-time Academy Award winner Kirk Lazarus. And MTV Movie Award Best Kiss winner Tobey Maguire.
The parodying of both Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness is just exceptional, and it relentlessly mocks crybaby spoiled actors and action stars. I'll defend Tropic Thunder endlessly, and it's pretty surprising to think that the Academy actually saw it for the satire it was able to appreciate that they were the butt of the joke, and still give that nod to Downey's performance. Congrats on the win, Bobby. Well deserved.
I'd like to thank my terrible childhood and the Academy in that order.
And then we had Age of Ultron coming in 2015. I have a secret, a deep, dark secret. You ready? I like this movie. Quite a lot, actually. It has issues, but I've basically never understood the incessant hate. And so I'm a little bit nervous to share any commentary on it because I want to be able to focus on sharing the things I like about this movie without feeling overly defensive about it or like I need to bend over backwards to justify my enjoyment of it. But after going against what is sort of the popular opinion with Iron Man 3 and having all sorts of supporters come out in the comments agreeing that that movie is actually very good, then hey, maybe I'll find the Ultron lovers out there too. I'll still do my best to make sure I'm approaching the review in the same manner I would any other of these movies, trying to balance personal opinions with some degree of objectivity. And maybe, if you're an Ultron hater, by the end of this, you'll have found some new things to appreciate about the movie. I do think a big thing for many people was the expectations of this movie. Based on the trailers, people thought Marvel was going way darker with the story, and that they were going to make some kind of superhero horror film. The trailers were really creepy and a little unsettling. I really loved them too, Ultron especially, driven by Spader's commanding narration. It looked like he was going to be nightmare fuel, rather than cracking jokes all along the way. Forgive a major tangent here, but ever since I saw Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak at release, I remember reading how upset he was that his gothic romance was instead marketed as a horror, when he had no say in the trailer or marketing whatsoever. That expectation set by the trailers led to a mixed reception, as people had been advertised something very different from what they got. It creates a scenario where people aren't judging the material on its own. As if I wasn't already soured on trailers for often spoiling entire movies, Crimson Peak was the example that led to me largely discrediting trailers as being anything reliable or representative of the end product. An auteur horror director like Robert Eggers made his big-budget fantasy revenge movie The Northman, and it's being marketed like an action-adventure. Also, auteur and horror are two words that I already struggle to get out properly, so having to say auteur horror is like, it's just marbles in my mouth. Trailers can be a ton of fun. I'd point to Mission Impossible Fallout or the new Batman. Those are unreal good trailers. But it's a risky game to bank your enjoyment of a movie on what was shown in what amounts to a 2-minute ad designed explicitly to get us into a theater. If a movie were a burger, then the trailer is that fake version of the burger assembled by food stylists to be the most appealing thing to the most number of people. And that's not always going to be reflective of the actual end product. Looking back to Marvel, while a super dark, frightening version of Age of Ultron sounds cool, I am putting that out of mind and reviewing the final movie without consideration of the product the trailer creators tried to sell us on. It seems unfair to judge a movie based on a version of it that was never intended to be. But it does provide a great opportunity to talk about the overall presentation of this sequel. If I hadn't already hammered on about it, it might not be obvious that this was again directed by Joss Whedon. He took a dramatically different approach this time, opting for a far more cinematic visual language. Compare any 2 shots between these Avengers movies, it literally doesn't matter which, and they look so wildly different. The aspect ratio is back to what we'd expect, everything is much darker, and the contrast is dialed way up. Considering this movie released surrounded by the likes of Guardians 1, Ant-Man, Civil War, and Doctor Strange, 4 movies that are horribly graded and washed out, I'm shocked to see how great this movie looks. It's far from the best in the franchise. I think many of the action scenes have gray settings fighting gray robots, and some of the more subdued tones were used as a cheat to make the movie feel more serious. So while I think the higher contrast gives the movie richer depth, it does occasionally still mute colors. It was mostly balanced in a way that allows the red, green, blue, purple, and other bright, loud colors of our heroes to pop on screen. It was a really fun idea to have these brightly colored heroes fighting in the snow. Everything is so bright and clear and defined, even when it's graded to be a little more dull than reality. Overall, I think the action scenes suffer from color correcting more than any dialogue scenes. But I've never found anything hard to track during this movie. The action is still clean and clear. If they had managed to make the entire movie look as good as any of the scenes where characters are standing around and hanging out, it'd be among the best looking Marvel films ever. So I think the look of this movie is 2 steps forward and 1 step back compared to the first Avengers. But it still feels like an overall improvement to me, and is far from being a drawback of any kind. Apparently, this movie had a lot of studio meddling. I'm very used to the end result of quote-unquote studio meddling being something like Suicide Squad. It was much more minor on this production, but still had large ramifications on the end product. Whedon was burnt out from making the first movie, and was now being handed the duty of writing the script from scratch on top of it all. Whedon wanted to mix things up, making a smaller, more personal story with these characters, and was told to repeat as much of the formula of the first Avengers as possible. That was the whole reason they hired him back. So the fact that he managed to make this movie feel distinct from the first at all is a small miracle, but is also directly the reason why people continually criticize Marvel for being formulaic. Anyone who tried to do anything distinct was told by the studio heads to make it more like the ones that were successful. And now that things haven't been going so hot for them lately, this appears to be the approach they're now leaning back on, for better or worse. This again goes back to the era of the Marvel Creative Committee. Ike Perlmutter, famous hater of women and member of the Marvel Creative Committee, wanted Whedon to cut the barn scene, and only allowed him to keep it if he dedicated enough time to setting up Thor Ragnarok. Hence the stupid Thor vision pool scene. And for some larger context, by the time this creative committee was dissolved, Civil War had already been shot and Doctor Strange was deep into production. So looking at this franchise, it makes sense of why many of these movies at this time looked visually dull. It was the creative committee trying to squash down their creators and stick to a bland, safer house style. New life being breathed into the franchise around 2017 with Ragnarok and Guardians 2 came immediately following the disbanding of the Marvel Creative Committee. Woohoo! But the making of Age of Ultron was still an uphill battle. I want to talk about Ultron early on, as I really like the character. I think everyone can agree that Spader is a legend, and his voice alone made him a great choice. As an actor, he is so good at delivering his lines with so much weight and gravitas, and the few times in this movie where he's given that opportunity.
But, like the man said, what doesn't kill you just makes me stronger.
He is so wildly intimidating. I think that entire scene is also well lit and filmed, and his final design is excellent. Obviously, performance is not the issue here. Spader is unreal in the role. And while touching on his design, yes, it is weird that they gave Ultron lips. And maybe he would have been scarier and more intimidating in a different way without an articulating face. But I also think it would have risked washing out some of the nuance in Spader's delivery. He's crushing it. I want him to emote. I wouldn't want it to be made stiff or more robotic. And even if his delivery remained the same, I think a neutral face would have been a bit of a disservice. I'm also certain there's some shallow metaphorical purpose to be read into it, like Ultron hates humanity, yet chose to make himself a bipedal anthropomorphized being. He believes he's evolved past it, yet remains physically connected. Something like that. Sure, why not? The one time I dislike it, though, is when his heart gets ripped out. Why is he gasping in pain? Is he just that committed to the bit? And why did you build yourself an oily little robot heart, you weirdo? It just doesn't make any sense. I think people mostly took issue with the sassy goofball characterization. While that is especially odd considering the actor they cast, as he could have easily given us a genuinely terrifying villain, I actually like how Ultron is written in this movie. Not all of it works.
Children, I lost the word there.
Like, come on, man. You have access to the entirety of the internet and you miss a single word? It's just kind of strange. Maybe it's a processing limitation or a product of him being young, but neither of those explanations is really satisfactory to me. Beyond that, I think the majority of his other gags do work well for me.
I will not be blackmailed by some ineffectual, privileged, effete, soft-penis debutante. You want to start a street fight with me, bring it on, but you're going to be surprised by how ugly it gets. You don't even know my real name. I'm the Lizard King.
No, wait, sorry, not that one.
Is that why you've come? To end the Avengers?
I've come to save the world. But also, yeah.
We have to think of how Ultron came to be. His consciousness spawned through a combination of the Mind Stone, Jarvis, Tony Stark, Bruce Banner, and the entirety of the internet. His father is a non-stop jokey joke maker.
Go ahead, make your jokes, Mr. Jokey. Joke maker.
Mixing all those personalities together in a genocidal superbot and having it come out this quirky yet scary villain is fairly unique, totally unexpected, and something that works for me. Let's look back at that children line, because the dialogue preceding that is actually super hardcore.
Everyone creates the thing they dread. Men of peace create engines of war. Invaders create Avengers.
I wish that the script left room for Ultron to jump between that level of intensity and insanity, more often separated out from the little comedic beats.
What's the vibranium for?
I'm glad you asked that because I wanted to take this time to explain my evil plan.
Small lines like that, where he's directly sassing Tony, work because he's trying to show he's better and smarter than his creator, with this added touch of venom that he inherited from Tony. The times he's making jokes for his own sake, or following up his badass lines with a punchline, seems to be where things work less well. It becomes more obvious he's not doing it for any reason other than to keep things light for the audience. While I think it lands more often than it doesn't, I have to admit that there was clearly a better version buried within the script that would have struck more of a balance. There's less joking per minute in this sequel, which means when a joke doesn't land, it stands out even worse, even though it's still an incredibly joke-heavy movie. So often things feel forced and inserted unnaturally. I have to assume that was a product of writing a more mature script and then being told, no, it has to be funny. I'm also a fan of the way he's constantly upgrading himself, partially mirroring the way that Tony has continually upgraded his armor, with Ultron debuting new physical forms in pursuit of some form of perfection. He was designed to exceed the Avengers, and it gives him this vicious superiority god complex. Again, things that have clearly come from Stark, and he both knows and resents it. He's far from perfect, being filled with rage, throwing a tantrum the second he's compared to Tony.
But I always say, keep your friends rich and your enemies rich and wait to find out which is which. What?
Tony Stark used to say that. To me.
What? I'm not. You think I'm one of Stark's puppets, his hollow men. Look at me. Do I look like Iron Man? Stark is not.
How closely his personality is linked to Tony's is properly shown when they come face to face shortly after that.
We'd have to break anything.
Clearly, you've never made an omelet.
You beat me by 1 second.
It's such a tiny inclusion, but it drives home that Ultron is the worst of Tony smushed into this vibranium shell. And he's constantly goading the team because there's no physical risk to him.
And you're not going anywhere. Of course not. I'm already there. You'll catch on.
He's scary as hell because they can't really kill him. He has an unlimited number of bodies to retreat to, which becomes his downfall, but more on that at the end. I've seen people argue that Whedon wrote Ultron this way because he's incapable of writing serious characters, stories, or themes. Go tell that to Buffy or Firefly. He can do it, and he can do it exceedingly well. The Body from Buffy is still one of the best episodes of TV I've ever seen. It was a choice to make Ultron what he is, and that choice was derived from making him inherently linked to Tony. Feel free to disagree with that choice of direction for the villain, but I dismiss the idea that Whedon's incapable of doing serious work. Just listen to some of these spectacular lines.
There were more than a dozen extinction-level events before even the dinosaurs got theirs. When the Earth starts to settle, God throws a stone at it. And believe me, he's winding up.
That's poetry. It's epic, intense, and over the top in all the best ways. People act like Whedon exclusively writes dialogue like, welp, that just happened.
Get off, super bitch!
And it really minimizes what a great writer he can be. They further humanize Ultron beyond all that. He grows a clear attachment to the twins, and when they eventually betray him, we witness every insecurity of his come pouring out.
Please, don't do this.
What choice do we have?
My main thesis here is that a couple lame jokes aside, Ultron is an incredible villain that reflects on the heroes, being a direct result of their hubris, Tony especially. This movie exemplified how warped Tony's perspective is, carrying his own deep emotional issues. He becomes haunted by the vision of seeing all his friends die, feeling that will be his legacy. And he takes all his own insecurities, fears, emotional stuntedness, skewed viewpoints, and unintentionally dumps it into Ultron. And finally, this is driven home by Wanda having peeked into both Tony and Ultron's minds. In an interesting way, she understands Tony better than probably anybody else on the team thanks to this. And through that, she recognizes how directly linked these characters are.
Ultron can't tell the difference between saving the world and destroying it. Where do you think he gets that?
Ultron carries the same beliefs as Tony and simply employs them to different ends. It's like his viewpoint never grew beyond that of pre-Iron Man Tony working as an arms dealer. Hopefully, all of that or some of it convinces at least one person that Ultron is a great character and villain in spite of one or two rocky moments in the script. An exciting part of this movie that works exceedingly well is that we get to kick off with an already fully formed Avengers team. For once, we get to see them operating in full force. The 2012 movie was like their own origin film, while Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame are all about the team being torn apart and trying to come back together. So a huge appeal of Age of Ultron is actually getting to see the Avengers as a well-oiled team, with plenty of experience working together, kicking ass like it's their day job. Because it is. The movie opens with them retrieving the scepter again, as they now know that S.H.I.E.L.D. was instead Hydra, meaning they previously handed the scepter straight over to the enemy. The movie opens with an absolutely wonderful sequence, playing out a continuous shot of our heroes ripping through goons, before all coming together for a big action pose. Whedon just gets how to turn these flashy sequences into splash page worthy moments. He has a great eye for making these already cool sequences feel pulled straight from the pages of a comic. So that quality of his directing has definitely carried over. They squeeze loads of other awesome moments into this raid, like Hulk smashing through a bunker, followed up by the camera tracking Tony as he takes down the shields. Cap has these awesome magnets on his arm now, which make a lot more sense out of the shield boomeranging back to him. Thor hitting the hammer into Cap's shield is something they learned by accident in the last movie, but now use as this heavy-hitting finisher move. This opening scene is just excellent. It's so funny that the opening word of this movie is shit! Maybe this is the darkest MCU movie. But really, the gag of everyone treating Cap as a huge dork works for me. This guy is from the 40s. A harsh word for him would be heck.
Language!
So I think it's hilarious that they're ribbing on him while bringing him up to a modern vernacular. We never really talk about how many people the Avengers kill, eh? Never killing is such an important part of a character like Batman that it becomes a major debate in every DC movie. Whereas Cap is a soldier, Widow is an assassin, Iron Man was an arms dealer, Thor has fought in like 1,000 wars, and Hulk could break someone's spine with a sneeze. There's no real pulling your punches for guys like Thor or Hulk. Like, Steve throws an entire motorcycle at a Jeep. It's very stylish, but you're gonna have to walk home now, you realize. Maybe not the right move transit-wise, but I just never really thought about how deadly their encounters truly are. If our eventual revised Avengers lineup someday has characters like Spider-Man and Daredevil as a focal point, and they're fighting against actual real humans, it's gonna become a very strange thing to balance out the fact that half the team isn't cool with killing. I'll be really curious to see if they ever address that or how they handle it. It's very odd to me how little they did with Baron von Strucker. He was in a post-credit scene and then this opening scene. It seems his purpose was strictly to create the twins, which occurred off-screen. We never even saw enough of the character for me to wish we had seen more of him. It just felt awfully strange to seemingly hype him up just to kill him off screen later in this movie. At least he got this one great line ahead of that.
No surrender! No surrender!
I'm going to surrender.
God damn, the twins' origin story is just brutal. Trapped for days, waiting for a Stark-branded bomb to blow up and kill them all. Tony still has issues, but he had a long career as a bad dude. I like the idea that he is constantly paying the price for that. Iron Man exists as a hero, but it's also about him atoning for a lifetime worth of sin. And Ultron is the ultimate example of his reach exceeding his grasp and creating more problems than he's solving. Whedon has stated that he introduced the twins so that he could work with a pair of characters who did something other than punch hard. While I can get behind that reasoning to add some variety to the fights, it's kind of odd when looking at the full team. Sure, Cap, Widow, and Hulk mostly punch, but they all have tools, gear, and other abilities. He just never got that creative with what Tony and Thor are capable of doing, so that's a bit of his own fault. He has a few imaginative uses for their powers in both movies, but clearly missed some of that potential that was right in front of him. And I find that he still largely misused Quicksilver in this movie. Maybe it's unfair because he had to live up to the incredibly successful Fox version of the character, but he rarely did slow-mo speedster scenes, and mostly just did these blue motion blurs. So he managed to still somehow choose to present the least interesting version of that character's powers. I also feel like from an acting perspective, that Aaron Taylor Johnson was kinda wasted in the role. Nocturnal Animals, Tenet, heck, even Kick-Ass. This guy is awesome. He had like 7 lines in Age of Ultron, and he did his best with them. As an aside, it's genuinely quite funny that he's now filming for his 3rd comic book movie character in Sony's ill-advised solo Kraven movie. That poor guy. So many actors have had comic book redemptions. Ben Affleck, Ryan Reynolds, Michael B. Jordan, and Oscar Isaac all come to mind, while this guy is on the opposite trajectory. His introduction works well, and I like that it's done from the Avengers' perspective in this particular moment. Watching him wreck Hawkeye and Cap in a way where we can't even see what's going on makes him feel incredibly strong, although he pretty well never feels up to that level again anywhere else in the movie. This version of the character isn't used to facing other superpowered individuals and is shown to get tired easily, so he's never much of a threat. They had to cap his powers somehow. Then, Wanda, on the other hand, I have no notes. Elizabeth Olsen is perfect in the role. Back to the raid scene. First, allow me to chastise Tony for stepping out of his suit. His ability to do so is a cool upgrade, and I think Sentry Mode is also a dope idea. But what if literally anything happens here, dude? Some booby traps? Someone comes running around any corner other than where your Sentry Mode is pointed? You're gonna wish you had that suit on. But Robert Downey Jr. is immediately doing his thing, taking a barely funny line.
Please be a secret door, please be a secret door, please be a secret door.
Yay! And crushing the delivery. His restrained, giddy little yay absolutely kills me. After rewatching this movie, I was in the middle of writing the script right before Multiverse of Madness dropped. I'll avoid spoilers for that one, but one note I had made for myself about Age of Ultron was that I am obsessed with the twitchy, horror-like way Wanda moves around in this opening scene. It's freaky and super distinct from everyone else. It's something I sorely missed seeing from the character, and I was so thrilled to see that Sam Raimi, with his own strong horror background, was able to bring that back to her character. Wanda is a million miles from her full power still, yet is able to quickly and easily worm her way into the minds of Earth's mightiest heroes, showing them their deepest fears. And I find it very funny that she specifically doesn't mind control Hawkeye to spare Renner from having to play that boring version of the character twice in a row.
I've done the whole mind control thing.
Not a fan.
Look at her sinister grin as Tony takes the scepter. It's horrific. Elizabeth Olsen does such phenomenal work with this character right from the very beginning. There's a reason Wanda has become many people's favorite character in the franchise. Well, she's one of mine. I'd be surprised if many people would disagree with that. As things are wrapping up, we get a first look at Tony's Iron Legion. I think it's incredibly significant that our first look at this is in the context of people actively rejecting it. Tony is trying to force this solution on the world, and no one was asking for it. But the concept of him introducing this and playing around with the idea makes complete sense for his character trajectory. Since destroying all his suits in Iron Man 3, he is looking for ways to protect the planet without having to suit up himself every time. And it perfectly paves the way for creating a more advanced AI that would be capable of autonomously carrying out that role. I wish we could have learned a little bit more about how the team learned to calm down the Hulk and how Natasha and Bruce formed that specific special bond. I actually quite like the idea of these two's blossoming relationship. I mean, other than the fact that Ruffalo is 17 years older. Ugh. But showing Natasha crushing on Bruce while he's equal parts oblivious and frightened of that prospect allows us to fill in some blanks of how this all came to be, that it's clearly been slowly building for a while now. I disagree with a lot of the complaints around their relationship, claiming that it feels forced or rushed. Nat has friendships with Clint, Tony, and Steve, so it's not like they haven't explored more platonic sides of Nat's relationships, and it's almost shocking that they had the restraint to go 3 movies without forcing a love interest on their lead female character. We've seen Nat and Bruce forming a bond even in the last movie.
So, this all seems horrible.
I've seen worse.
Sorry.
No, we could use a little worse.
Between moments like that, or literally the opening scene of her retrieving Bruce, they're clearly shown to have some level of rapport. Well, I'm sure it took a lot to go from fleeting interactions like that, all the way through to her being the one capable of doing the lullaby. They've clearly been avenging for a few years at this point. Look at them flirting at the party.
I've seen her flirt. Up close. This ain't that.
I don't see anything forced or rushed here. She explicitly states why she's falling for him.
All my friends are fighters. And here comes this guy. Spends his life avoiding the fight because he knows he'll win.
And they're both damaged people, trying to build a connection neither of them has otherwise been able to achieve in their lives before. I think that's an excellent reason for them to be drawn to one another, and also a very clear explanation for why things aren't developing and progressing that naturally. I have some issues with it, but I'm gonna save that for a little later because it ties in better to a different talking point. But one thing that I think would have helped us all buy into that relationship a little more, other than simply teasing it further in the first movie, would have been that if they had in any way at any time addressed what happened between Bruce and Betty. As the viewers, we're left in this weird lurch where we have to assume that Bruce still loves her. It's a shame this series dumped that romance off screen because it could have been a really interesting dynamic. That Bruce is falling for Nat, someone who will inherently understand him better than Betty ever could, and doesn't know how to reconcile that with these lifelong feelings he's had for someone who is supposedly the love of his life. What a missed opportunity for an incredibly strong emotional underline to this movie. We would have the high-stakes action, the incredibly personal miscalculations and failures of Tony, while still maintaining that more intimate, more personal story Whedon wanted to tell by having this love triangle that's creating a rift in the team. I just think that would have fit together really well with this movie. And before I move on from this entirely, Nat and Bruce aren't the only ones crushing in this movie.
Unlike you, I don't have a lot of time for parties. Will Thor be there?
Aw, you go, Helen. Back on the ship, we have this amazing 1 second long gag of Jarvis is my co-pilot, just in the form of a sticker. I love stupid extra details like that. I also appreciate the inclusion that Banner is clearly still at odds with the Hulk. They can work together, but simply acknowledging the concept of a code green means that he doesn't default to bringing the Hulk out. They can work together, but he's still uncomfortable with that power.
The gates of hell are filled with the screams of his victims. But not the screams of the dead, of course. No. Wounded screams, mainly whimpering, great deal of complaining, and tales of sprained deltoids and gout.
I had never paid this line much mind before, but I really like it now.
What kind of monster would let a German scientist experiment on them to protect their country?
It made me miss Erskine. Stanley Tucci, you beautiful bald baby boy. Really, Steve has this very particular level of gentlemanly sass that I love seeing come out here and there. This regeneration cradle that creates tissue is an insane invention. Futuristic sci-fi stuff on this level would completely change the world, and I don't think it's ever mentioned outside of this movie again. I mean, it's not like the movie's ever really addressed the ways Tony inventing clean energy or time travel have affected the world. I don't know how or where you'd fit that fallout of each and every one of those advancements into any of the movies. While I think it could have been cool to see Tony and Bruce's early attempts at Ultron in my suggested Science Boys movie, I think this film effectively skips past it. We quickly get the impression these two have talked about this many, many times. And with Tony's Iron Legion already in place, a history with advanced AI creation and desire to provide global protection, pursuing
peace in our time,
all mixed with his insane overconfidence that he can fix everything, chasing something like Ultron is the obvious end point of his journey. I know comic fans were upset as Ultron originally came from Hank Pym, but the way they laid it out in the MCU makes perfect sense for Tony to arrogantly plow ahead with this pursuit. I've never really liked the physical orbs that are shown to represent Jarvis and the Mind Stone. Like, I don't know what else they could have done to visually present that complexity, or to show Ultron attacking Jarvis. It's all just kind of preposterous, and since I can't think of anything less silly to present that to the audience, I kind of just have to accept it. The one thing that does make this work is what phenomenally good voice actors Spader and Bettany are. Spader especially. He has maybe one of the best voices ever. Damn. While the movie never explicitly addresses it, I think it's so funny that the second Ultron is exposed to the internet, his immediate conclusion is to destroy the planet. I genuinely think the best scenes in this movie are the main two where everyone is taking a breather, hanging out, and just sort of interacting. It's rad as heck to see everyone fly around and blast holes through bad guys, but none of that matters without a depth of character that makes us care about their relationships. Buffy the Vampire Slayer had a network TV budget. There was only so much action and effects they could do, so the majority of the runtime in every episode was characters gathering together to hang out, goof around, and make plans. This is something Whedon is exceptionally good at, and it's front and center at Tony's party and again at Clint's farm. We'll get to that one later, but first, the party scene. Generally, I'm a fan of having characters like Falcon, War Machine, and Maria Hill here. It's just nice to see this small scene be sprinkled with cameos to remind us how big this universe has already become. War Machine is just lame Iron Man, you can't convince me otherwise, so playing that up for a joke is kind of fun for me, and it's the most I've ever loved Cheadle in the role. He seems like such a poser, and his story just utterly bombs.
I'm like, boom, you looking for this?
And what's even better is Thor trying to courteously make up for his underreaction.
Boom. Are you looking? Why do I even talk to you guys? Everywhere else that story kills.
That's the whole story?
Yeah, it's a War Machine story.
Oh, this is very good then. That's impressive.
And later, when Rhodey tells the story again to non-heroes and gets the reaction he was fishing for, his little self-assured nod after his joke lands is brilliant. We have Tony and Thor bickering over their girlfriends, and while that little macho showdown is a little funny, I do like how Thor caps it off.
But Jane's better.
Stating it so explicitly at the end does kind of crack me up. The funny thing is that by Civil War, Pepper and Tony are on the rocks, while this is maybe the last time Jane is mentioned until Love and Thunder. It allows us to read into this scene that they are both insecure in their relationships and are overcompensating. But I don't think that was what they were going for at the time. Stan Lee getting obliterated drunk on Thor's space booze is among my favorite of his cameos. Excelsior. And of course, at the end of all that, just the core team having a nightcap while taking turns trying to lift Mjolnir is up there as one of the all-time best scenes in the franchise. It's silly, playful, and just damn good fun. There are so many good character moments. Tony tries to outdo it with one of his iron gloves, then calling in his sidekick to help. Bruce tries to mess with everyone and nobody buys it. Natasha opts out entirely.
Oh, no, that's not a question I need answered.
And we get the wonderful gag and long-term setup of Cap squeaking it a fraction of a hair. I've seen fans suggest he could have lifted it and chooses to save Thor the embarrassment. But I prefer the headcanon that he had to first go through the events of Civil War. Once he no longer harbors the secret of Tony's parents, he has a clear conscience and emerges from that fully worthy. Plus, the whole scene is important to firmly establish how significant wielding the hammer is. I can't believe I didn't take the massive hint back in the day that maybe they were setting something up for later. It's cleverly masked behind what simply feels like nothing more than a fun excuse to have these heroes joke around with one another. And wrapping up the party, we have this twisted, lurching Iron Legion robot walk out. The moments before anyone knows what's happening, when they assume he's just a faulty droid talking nonsense, is great and pretty tense. They all put up their guards, but are just cautiously monitoring at first. The fight itself is pretty good, as it's exciting to see these heroes step up and contribute despite being mostly unarmed. It's a small matchup, but it raises the stakes, seeing Tony manually dismantle a flying droid with essentially no protection. The one thing that doesn't work in this scene and is a fairly major issue is the painfully lazy and unfunny gag of Bruce falling on Natasha's chest. It's insane that Whedon thought this was so funny that he used it again in Justice League. It's just so juvenile and really lowers the comedic bar for the entire movie. With that scene wrapped up and that terrible moment addressed, it'd be a great opportunity to hone in on the things, especially in the writing and humor, within this movie that just do not work. I know some people dislike the overuse of the language gag and didn't you see that coming, but I disagree with those. They both followed the rules of 3, so I actually enjoy them both and thought they were used the exact right amount. The things I dislike mostly come down to little moments.
Romanoff, you and Banner better not be playing hide the zucchini.
I pointed that out before, but it's stupid enough to earn its place in this list of crappy jokes. Or Ultron shouting,
"Oh, for God's sake!"
takes me out of the movie a bit. At least he didn't literally do a more memeable, "Welp, that just happened," but it was pretty damn near to it. One of the stupidest inclusions is Natasha saying beep beep when driving around on her motorcycle. Beep, beep. It's just so odd. Like, picture this. Scarlett had to sit down in a room somewhere and record who knows how many beeps to dub that in.
How'd you get to be so good?
Oh, just experience, I suppose. I started out as Roadrunner.
Meep. You mean?
No, they only paid me to say it once, then they doubled it up on the soundtrack. Cheap bastards.
A long time ago, I found a fan edit of Natasha that ripped that line to shreds. Not that it was ever a good line, but in some stupid way, it almost becomes worth it because of how funny this stupid edit is.
Straight through me. Soviet slug, no rifling. Bikinis.
I would argue that the majority of the humor works in this movie on a pure writing and delivery front. It just has to be weighed against the near-flawless humor of the first Avengers. And I think the larger issue is that the jokes less frequently emerged situationally in Age of Ultron. They feel more transparently made by committee, pointing at the script and saying, "Insert a joke here, nobody's joked in 3 minutes." And now, the same way that the first Avengers carries some blame for the gray era of Marvel, I think this movie heavily shoulders much of the burden of the insert joke here writing model that Marvel has yet to break free of. I don't think Whedon is exclusively to blame for this again, but he's not to blame, you know? Back to Ultron first being introduced. Tony cracking up and laughing while being grilled is a great character moment. It's dawning on him that his wild ambitions have once again exceeded his limits, and he's seeing his own pattern repeat. He obviously kept this project a secret, knowing everyone would object. For all his growth, he can still be a deeply selfish man, playing at God. Steve, having just weeded Hydra out of S.H.I.E.L.D. and taking down an aircraft that was made to kill millions, has more of a personal stake in this and obvious moral objection to Tony's intended mass surveillance and deterrent-style peacekeeping. Tying this back into the last Avengers movie, either the line of Tony opposing nuclear deterrence is even worse fitting than I thought.
A nuclear deterrent, because that always calms everything right down.
Or Tony only objects to a deterrent strategy when it's not his own. So maybe there's a bit of internal consistency there, but I still think that line should have come from somebody else on the team. It requires a bit too much assuming on our part to make it feel like it fits the character. While Age of Ultron has less jokes land than the original Avengers, the dialogue backed off the joking around to a greater extent than I remembered. Plenty of jokes are still present, but there is notably more room in these scenes for excellent strokes of writing genius.
How are you guys planning on beating that?
Together.
We'll lose.
And we'll do that together too.
That is one of the best, most iconic lines in the franchise. Nowadays, I feel that Marvel often tries to set up too much. Eternals tripped over itself to set up Black Knight, which already felt totally unnecessary, then at the end throwing Blade in the mix. I prefer more organic introductions rather than just being like, by the way, so-and-so exists. It pushes us to flush the current movie out of our brains and immediately start talking about the next. So I greatly appreciate the ways things are built more slowly in this movie. They introduce Wakanda tangentially through a Black Panther villain, Ulysses Klaue. That alone had everyone excited and talking. A few years later, they introduced T'Challa, and his solo movie came after that. In both cases, these inclusions were instrumental to the plot and drove things forward, rather than grinding to a halt to point and cheer at some unearned tease. Thanos at the end of the first Avengers was one of the only times I enjoyed that sort of reveal because it added context to everything we just witnessed and set up the future films. It helps that Andy Serkis is one of my absolute favorite actors. I've said that before in this series of reviews because Marvel has worked with such amazing talent over the years, but Serkis might actually be like a top 5 actor for me. And I'm not kidding when I say one of his best roles is Caesar in the Apes movies, especially those last 2 directed by Matt Reeves. Serkis is a wildly talented chameleon, changing his personality, voice, physicality, and everything else in every role he takes. He inhabits these characters in a way that feel totally separate from him, existing as fully fleshed out individuals in as little as a few minutes of screen time. Even in a bit part like this, it becomes apparent why he's been the pioneer of motion capture technology. Serkis might be one of the best physical actors on the planet. He completely changes the way he carries himself. Immediately, we witness Klaue with this powerful, commanding bearing, and get the sense that he's seen it all, been through it all, and that there's nothing on this earth that will faze this guy anymore. he's the most confident mother there is. Taking charge during this super-powered intimidation being leveraged at him, going so far as to openly tell them his biggest fear. He's just on a whole nother level. Both Serkis as an actor and Claw as a character. My understanding is that Andy Serkis was brought in to consult and help Ruffalo and Spader get more comfortable with motion capture, and they decided to cast him as Claw while they were at it. That was such a good pickup for this franchise. There's not much to this fight, it's pretty decent. It does have one of the best Pietro moments, when he's running and the camera pans up to show Thor fighting a drone in midair, then coming back down for him to uppercut Cap. That's excellent. It's such effective use of the camera to take this slowed down action as an excuse to pan around and highlight these characters doing what they do best. Why didn't they have way more of that in this movie? It even cracks me up when he attempts to grab Mjolnir in midair. But this scene is mostly about Wanda getting into everyone's heads, which is also cool.
The girl tried to warp my mind. Take special care. I doubt a human can keep her at bay. Fortunately, I am mighty.
That mighty dialogue is a hilarious nod to the comics, but also the comedic timing of him saying it as he wanders into a nightmare is very well done. I appreciate finally getting to see some of the Red Room. And while I enjoy the cameos of Peggy and Heimdall, I would have rather they played up the nightmares to be actually scary. They're all conceptually interesting, but I feel the movie doesn't do much with these. Steve's especially. As a bit of an aside, I would like to point out that Heimdall refers to Thor as Odinson.
You're a destroyer, Odinson.
It's assumed that Love and Thunder will follow the comics, with Thor being a title that is passed on to Jane, with our Thor becoming Odinson. I think it'd be great if they somewhat unintentionally set that up so long ago. I do appreciate that Hawkeye really steps up at this point. He had one cameo and one movie appearance that he was barely present for, so thankfully in this third outing they finally made use of him.
Yeah, you better run.
It's about time they started honing in on Renner's distinct style of dry humor. It gets refined in this movie, allowing him to stand out with loads of great lines in Civil War. I very, very much assume the Hulkbuster was designed to sell toys, but I don't even care. They did a great job of making sure this scene delivered something worthy of that product placement. Having Wanda in Hulk's mind creates a new excuse for Tony and Hulk to square off, and as you know, I eat that shit up. I do wish we would have seen a little bit of Banner's nightmare. It could have been some trippy sequence where his nightmare transforms into Hulk's nightmare as he loses control. That'd be a lot of dream sequences back to back, but I think there's so much more they could have done with that. I'm really eating my own words after my review of the 2008 Hulk movie, because here we are again, with Hulk properly existing with that menace quality I was looking for. It's so smart to have had the Science Boys team up to craft this anti-Hulk suit together, adding in interchangeable parts as Hulk inevitably rips it to shreds, and building things aimed at wrangling and detaining rather than outright winning, showing that Banner had plenty of input.
Go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep.
How can you not laugh at that? And the shot of Hulk spitting out a tooth is so damn good.
I'm sorry.
The only option for Tony is to bring a whole damn building down on top of him. The destruction this fight causes is excessive, which is exactly the point. After this, people are calling for Banner's arrest, and it sets him on the path of sending himself off planet. He's filled with shame, and this is the exact reason he had gone into exile all those years earlier. There's a great moment after that crash where Hulk looks around and sees how much damage he's caused and how terrified everyone is. After that shock and impact, Bruce is peeking through for a moment there, but as soon as Hulk sees the guns, he's immediately back in charge. After the team gets so thoroughly rattled, it makes sense that they would need to take a minute to regroup. I think it comes at exactly the right time for a slowdown in the pacing. A lot happened in the last 30 minutes. The farm is great as it's secluded off the grid and looks like somewhere I'd want to retire after the loud, action-packed life of a superhero. I'm a huge fan of the juxtaposition of these heroes decked out in all their super suits, hanging out on an acreage. But the whole scene is an awesome excuse to show us more of what Hawkeye has going on, and also have these characters take a minute to ask some big questions and figure each other out a little better. Overall, this movie does a remarkable job of showing what Hawkeye's role is on the team. He's never going to kick ass the same way as his superpowered teammates. He's not a financier, the brains, or the leader of the group. He's not even the most funny. Clint's just a grounded dude who gives more of a civilian angle on this team of superpowered beings. I don't think it's a stretch to say this movie did a lot to convince me he's the heart of the team. I think that is best exemplified in the final battle when he encourages Wanda to be a hero and coaches her into being an Avenger. I've had a crush on Linda Cardellini for about 20 years since she played Velma in those weirdly sexualized Scooby-Doo movies that were originally written to be R-rated by James Gunn, so that makes sense of a lot of things there. But she's always a delight, most recently being an absolute riot alongside Christina Applegate in Dead to Me. I'd recommend that show to anyone, by the way. In Age of Ultron, they do a good job having Laura skirt past a lot of tropes of the lonely, fearful, housekeeping mom/wife. She totally supports and values Clint and his work as an Avenger. She knows it's important and doesn't remotely guilt him over it. I appreciate how their spousal dynamic was written.
You are so cute.
Adam and Banner?
I'll explain when you're older. Hawkeye.
Oh, okay.
That's just a cute little exchange that I've always enjoyed. Beyond Clint and his family, there are loads of great moments out at the farm. A small, early one is Steve hesitating to go back inside and choosing to remove himself from it. It can be read one of two ways, both of which are meaningful. It could be because he's a man of war from a different era and doesn't really know how to kick back and take it easy. He's the star-spangled man with a plan and is at a complete loss here. Or we could read that he's uncomfortable being around a family and this normal life that he desperately wishes he had.
A little from column A, a little from column B.
The best part is, of course, when Tony and Steve get going on their philosophical differences. It's great for the same reason these two are always great together. Plus, we get to see some superpowered wood chopping, which is hilarious. But hot damn, Steve ripping wood apart is gnarly. And of course, Tony steals the scene with a wonderful final line.
Don't take from my pile.
They even found room for Fury to come back, mirroring the first movie where he once again gives the team a nudge when they need it most. It cuts away from the farm scene for a couple very short segments, showing us some of what Ultron is up to. I already said that I enjoyed his line about the vibranium frisbee, but he uses that as a jumping off point, taking it even further as this commentary on human nature and how they overlooked the Mind Stone within the scepter. And that's just a great payoff. The worst part of these cutaways is Thor's vision pool stuff. It's absurd, disinteresting, clearly just there to spoon-feed exposition as well as an excuse for a gratuitous shirtless scene, and robs us of getting to see Thor chilling on the farm and forming stronger relationships with the team. So this whole pool thing gets a thumbs down from me. I'll close out the farm discussion with what is inarguably the worst part of the whole thing, and this comes down to Nat and Bruce. They seemingly kept in the plot point that Bruce can't have sex without hulking out. Maybe the intention here is that he's scared he may pass on Hulk genetics, but I'll assume it's going back to the heart rate incel thing. I bet you never thought of the Hulk as an incel before, huh? Try to unthink that one. Nat's speech about her forced sterilization is gutting, and it's well delivered. Except that last line. That's the sticking point.
You still think you're the only monster on the team?
I get that she has some self-loathing, and her Wanda-fueled nightmare just brought this particular sore spot flooding back. But if her point had instead landed, as I assume it was intended, I've been sterilized, and being a ruthless killer makes me a monster, then it wouldn't stick out. But the poor ordering of it makes it feel like she's calling herself a monster because she can't have kids? Take it a step further back than that. In general, why is this the thread the script is pulling at? Sure, it's an old wound of hers that has been reopened. But what? These two are supposed to bond and fall in love because neither of them can have children? There are so many more engaging threads to pick at. Both of them, Bruce especially, just went through something horrible. Why aren't they talking about the fact that neither of them chose this life? Or that they've both hurt people against their will? They could even be exploring their pre-existing bond by reminiscing on how they first learned the lullaby trick, showing us some of how they inherently trust one another. I bet that'd get a lot more people on board with them as a couple, showing that this romance has been building much longer than we've ever been shown. What did the writers want us to make out of that monster line? I think they just thought it was so damn clever. People choose not to have kids all the time. Are they monsters? Do we really need to create this scenario where either the inability or choice not to have kids is demonized? It's lazy and insulting that Nat's singular moment of vulnerability in this movie is centered around her inability to reproduce. I don't think any of the content of this backstory is bad, and it's significant to share because it clearly matters to her. I have no issue with that. It's rather an issue of haphazard writing. I can see maybe what they were going for and the other ways to interpret this line, but it was so poorly handled and presented, did nothing important for her or Bruce's characterizations, and failed to develop their relationship meaningfully beyond a shared sense of pity. And that's never been a strong center of any romance. I imagine not everyone interpreted the scene this way, but it's absolutely a fault of this script that the interpretation I'm presenting felt so unavoidable. And while that interaction sticks out in a negative way, I feel it's a symptom of something larger in this movie. After having such a stellar outing in the first Avengers movie, Natasha is totally downgraded here. We have the boob faceplant, the monster speech, and then constantly tripping over herself for this romantic B-plot, which largely takes her out of the movie. After being a hardened spy for several movies, learning to open up should have been a really important arc. But they failed her character by jumping ahead to her already having all of her guards fully down. Introducing a love interest for her is fine. It just needed to be better balanced in this movie. It didn't leave room for anything else. It's genuinely shocking that it feels like it occupies all of her screen time, yet wasn't well developed. They kinda got it wrong on both ends. And it's even worse when later she's literally taken out of the movie for a damsel in distress scenario being held captive by Ultron. Even her rescue is weak. They just kind of walk into the room and let her out. I guess the Red Room flashback was neat and added to her character, but that's all she gets in this movie. That's so lame after building her up into an actual character in the Avengers and Winter Soldier. Throughout the movie, Black Widow is a capable participant in the fighting, and Johansson does her best with the script, and I will continue to defend the inclusion of the romance as I think there could have been something special there. It was just undercooked and so clunky. The logic of their love interest being drawn together is there, yet they failed to make it feel properly earned, and they didn't even attempt to do anything else with her character. So I like their romance, but I hate the execution. Let's get off this spiraling rant by talking about something I do really enjoy in this movie. I am a huge fan of how they navigated Hawkeye's character. Every little thing in this movie is pointing towards him getting killed off. Every trope and red flag is there. We learn more about his backstory and family. They humanize him with a baby on the way. They triple underscore him promising that he's only doing this one last job. And to cap it all off, he starts talking about the future, planning new home renovation projects. In hindsight, it felt like the movie was screaming that his days were numbered. It was telegraphed on every possible level. So with all that in mind, it was a genuine shock when Quicksilver is instead killed.
You didn't see that coming.
I really love the way they had begun to build up a friendship, one small jab at a time.
Nobody would know.
First, I love Renner's delivery there. It's maybe my favorite Hawkeye line in the entire movie. It was really smart to have him make the sacrifice for the guy he had specifically been building a little rivalry with throughout. He got to die a hero. And I know that it feels ridiculous for a speedster to get killed by guns, but again, this movie has directly shown us that neither Wanda and Pietro have reached their max power. Pietro quite easily gets overwhelmed, exhausted, and knocked around in this movie.
Stay down, kid.
And the capper of Clint naming his kid after Pietro is so darned sweet. The shared yet distinct bonds Clint so quickly built with both Pietro and Wanda again tell us Hawkeye is the heart of the team. I love him for it, and I think all of that was handled exceedingly well. Just in case I haven't spent enough time hyping up Wanda, the moment of her unleashing all her fury when Pietro dies is absolutely horrifying, and it's the earliest glimpse we get of her full power. She's just so cool. Next up, we have what is probably the biggest plot convenience possible. Ultron wants to transport the cradle, and he just starts driving it around? What the hell, dude? Just fly that unit like a mile into the sky away from where the majority of these guys can reach you, or something. He eventually does do that. I kind of forgot that he does, but probably should have just started with that maneuver. At least Black Widow does have the one insanely badass moment of sky surfing that thing onto the jet. So she wasn't completely deprived of standout moments. Let's not even get started on the actual capabilities of the cradle though. That thing can easily patch up Clint, which is handy, but also prints an entire human with a functioning brain. And you're telling me this thing couldn't just give Natasha her reproductive system back? I really can't get into it because space-age tech like this cradle is always going to bring with it infinite plot holes. If we wanted to take it fully seriously, no one could ever be hurt in this franchise again without us wondering, why aren't they using the cradle? I can just accept that that isn't an option without the movie telling me a precise reason why not. I don't want to get all cinema sins on details that would feel tedious for the movie to attempt to explain. It's not like this thing was introduced to heal Clint and then never used again. It creating Vision was the payoff. So it's okay to me if they don't really do more with it, at least they tied it back in one meaningful time. Then they can just destroy the cradle and say that Helen is incapable of recreating that without the Mind Stone's corrupting influence. Easy peasy. And while I dislike the Natasha kidnapping because it sticks her with nothing to do, I do still like that it shows us how Ultron is both delusional and insane, yet is desperate for companionship. He took it personally when the twins left and wants so badly to share his master plan with someone. Again, he's like Stark. If he doesn't have an audience, then he might as well have not done it. That glory and admiration is as important to him as a finished task. So while it's a disposal of Nat as a character, it does give us insight into Ultron, leaving me a little torn on the story beat as a whole. Otherwise, the big fight/chase combo is really cool. Ultron has some sort of magnetized power, I guess. He used it earlier to yank Tony's suit, but in this scene, he's ripping things out of the road and throwing cars. It's kind of awesome. I'm glad they gave him more than just lasers to fight with. Steve is such an amazing hero. He goes in basically knowing he'll lose a one-on-one fight with Ultron, but needs to buy some time. This badass is fighting something made out of indestructible metal and somehow holds his own. He's just the best. Pietro and Wanda stopping the train is excellent. It's rewarding to see them get a taste of that hero life, saving the civilians. It's a shame that it's wrapped up as quickly as it is. That was a defining sequence for the twins, and I think it could have been twice as long and could have been made to feel as large of a turning point as it actually is. Plus, just the pair of these two don't really get to interact alone very much in this movie. I wanted to see more of them just being siblings. The second they have the cradle in their hands, Tony and Bruce start debating whether they should complete Vision.
I'm in a loop. I'm caught in a time loop. This is exactly where it all went wrong.
The whole debate is excellent and shows that in a sick way, Tony has yet to learn a lesson from all of this. After Wanda and Pietro show up, we get what is possibly my favorite Bruce line of all time.
Oh, we're way past that. I could choke the life out of you and never change a shade.
It's among the best lines in the whole franchise. As much as Bruce and Hulk are treated as secondary, Whedon clearly loved writing for this character and gave him so many amazing lines across both movies. As the debating winds further up, it's fun to see them start escalating things by using their powers to try and get an upper hand. That is, until Thor shows up and fast-forwards everything through a good old-fashioned bolt of lightning, his #1 problem solver. The birth, for lack of a better word, of Vision is so good. It comes with only 35 minutes left in the movie, so they only had that long to get us on board with the character, and they absolutely nailed it. His first moments come with sheer panic and confusion, floating aimlessly around while everyone is totally on edge and not sure what to do.
I'm sorry, that was odd.
The sequence is kind of beautiful, and we immediately have this elegant mystique surrounding the character. I've loved Paul Bettany ever since A Knight's Tale, and the inclusion of this character is made all the more awesome having heard the real-life anecdote that some big shot producer told Bettany his career was over. And he got the call from Whedon to play Vision literally as he was walking out of that building, giving Bettany an excuse to finally physically play a character in this franchise after already voicing one for 7 years was excellent. It's dope that Vision thus became a child of Tony, Banner, and Thor. I know this was already his color combo in the comics, but I kinda love that given this context, his red, yellow, and green kinda match Iron Man and Hulk. They even add in a literal connection to Thor as well when he materializes himself a cape and bracers after seeing Thor's. I just think him ripping off some of that style is the funniest thing possible. He's been alive for 30 seconds and is already stealing Odin's son's swag. Vision bursts into the world already harboring such complex thoughts and emotions. He's one of the most fascinating characters in the MCU. Like Ultron, he's a wild array of different characters fused together with only a vague semblance of a human side, trying to understand humanity and philosophy.
I am on the side of life. Ultron isn't. He will end it all.
His whole speech is enthralling and explores a greater depth of character in just a few minutes of screen time than other characters get over entire multi-movie arcs. To let that sink in even further, he's only in this movie for 6 minutes. Between Ultron, Civil War, and Infinity War, he only had a total of 23 minutes of screen time. I just desperately need more of this character. Between my personal love of Wanda and Vision as characters, it's no wonder that I just loved WandaVision, but I'm gonna have to talk about that way later on in this video series. And one of the most wonderful payoffs and an ingenious hack to simultaneously get us and the Avengers on Vision's side is the moment when he lifts Mjolnir off screen.
But we need to go.
I swear every single person in the entire theater either gasped or cheered or lost all sense of their faculties as their lizard brains kicked in with pure excitement. Plus, it gave us this lovable moment.
It's terribly well balanced.
Well, if there's too much weight, you lose power on the swing.
Now we enter another massive third act. Generally, I like the idea of turning a city into a meteor. It's at least unique in the mix of big final battles across comic book movies, and there's something fascinating about Ultron getting hung up on this physical cataclysmic event. That this futuristic, space-aged robot is instead going for something with such a biblical quality to it. We do again have the trope of fighting a horde of generic enemies, and again, I don't really mind this for these bigger movies, and really, this one is extra cool and among my favorites of the generic hordes, because these are kind of a bastardized version of Tony's Iron Legion, forcing him to confront his dream of a suit of armor around the world. I'm glad we got to see Stark and Ultron square off once again. They both immediately start up the banter, both buying themselves more time. Like father, like son. Cap's speech is short, sweet, and to the point.
The rest of us have one job. Tear these things apart. You get hurt, hurt them back. You get killed, walk it off.
That's the funniest Cap's ever been. As things are really kicking off, Pietro runs into a police station and just starts shouting about evacuation. That is a terrible plan. After that obviously fails, he comes back firing a gun, which is somehow even more stupid. That'll get people's attention, sure, but they're gonna be ducking for cover and fortifying that station, not rushing out to start saving people. That scene has always bothered me. It's neither a good plan nor illogical enough to become funny. It's just a stupid thing that a crazy person would do, and it put more people at risk than it helped. In general, though, I do like that they brought back all the small moments of the team assisting average people mixed in with this climax. They're fighting off killer drones, but also saving individuals along the way. That is so important and far too often overlooked in these big climaxes, and just always appreciated in a superhero movie. They should be mitigating casualties and damages any way they can along the way. Steve gets loads of cool action moments in this battle. It keeps cutting to him in 3-second snippets where he's doing something awesome, like Thor batting the shield through a bunch of robots, or him using his own magnet arm to yank one of the droids his shield is implanted in. Overall, it's actually really disappointing how little Cap had to do all movie. He has some great scenes squaring off with Tony, but that's his main role. I guess it makes sense that the majority of things are centered around Tony specifically, as this was all his fault, but it makes it so that everyone else feels just kind of along for the ride. At least Steve is paid more mind than Thor, but I think the cast hit some sort of critical mass in this movie that went beyond what Whedon was capable of juggling. He's used to doing big ensembles on TV, but when you have a full season to work with, you can have a Xander episode, then a Willow episode, then a Buffy and Dawn episode. You can kind of juggle things around a lot more easily. Here, he had to give everyone equal focus and just very much does not manage to do so. And with all their nifty tricks and abilities fighting things out, everyone is immediately outshone when Wanda emerges in slow motion. She just starts wrecking shit with her crazy witch powers. Oh, it's so good. I love her so much. As things are ramping up, they have a serious conversation about potentially needing to destroy Sokovia to save the planet. In the last movie, the government made that final nuclear decision, and the Avengers managed to avert that destruction. So it's a cool parallel that this time that insane power and decision is directly in the Avengers' hands. They keep it as an absolute last resort and intended to sacrifice themselves to save as many individuals as possible. That's the full-on Avengers level heroics I want to see. They are, of course, bailed out from such a dark outcome by the arrival of the helicarrier. I had to Google how the Hell Fury was able to do this despite S.H.I.E.L.D. being dismantled and him presumably having zero resources. Like, how is this ship even still available or operational? Was it not decommissioned and the, whatever it is, 5,000 employees not stuck looking for other work? Somehow they're this standing militia ready to go at a moment's notice? Surely it costs millions of dollars just to get this big unit off the ground. It turns out the fate of the helicarrier and how they're able to rally together to help out here is addressed in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So I don't have the full context, but it does seem odd and kind of dumb to burn S.H.I.E.L.D. to the ground just to include something like this that makes that fallout seem totally unimportant. Without seeing that setup or how it plays out in the show, this is pretty jarring. I do like this guy in the white shirt who keeps stumbling on his words.
Number 6 boat is topped and locked, or stocked top. It's full of people.
Apparently, he's the same guy who remained loyal to S.H.I.E.L.D. in Winter Soldier when Rumlow pointed a gun at his head. There's a fun bit of continuity there. Good for him getting a promotion, he earned it. It makes it more than just a throwaway gag. He's totally new to this and is understandably learning the job on the fly. Get it? Because they're flying. I guess it's nice to see War Machine arrive to take part in the big end battle. It is a little odd that he just kind of disappears for the majority of the movie. I think the idea is that he had some governmental duties during this crisis, but Falcon just didn't feel like coming into work today, huh? Cashing in some vacation days, maybe? Very convenient timing. Rhodey's best moment is probably him witnessing Vision and just being totally thrown off by what he's seeing.
Okay, what?
Once the tides turn in their favor, we get a bunch more of these awesome splash page worthy moments of them defending that final key. I point it out so often because it's a quality of these two movies that was exceptionally well done and is really lacking in the rest of the franchise. Vision rushes Ultron and burns him out of the internet. Yeah, I don't know, that's how that works, I guess. They just fried his router. But what it means is that the bodies he currently has in that moment are now all he has left. I used to think that was an annoying plot hole. Like, why wouldn't he have stored backups somewhere? Even Zola managed to stash himself away on floppy disks for 50 years or whatever, but I once again point to the Stark connection. The simplest explanation I could give, and one that satisfies my own questioning, is that Ultron was simply overly confident and didn't envision a scenario where he might fail. Tony literally made Ultron without failsafes, because he didn't imagine anything other than complete success. Similarly, Ultron's certainty in his success was absolute. As they start ganging up on the main Ultron, melting him with a combination of various beams is just a great visual.
You know, with the benefit of hindsight...
Apparently, interrupting evil speeches has become Hulk's signature thing, although it's maybe a bit lazy to reuse that gag. I also have no idea why they initiate calming down Hulk with no real indication that their job is done. Hey, at least this movie has the fly jumping thing that I really like, and the perspective shot showing Nat wake up in mid-air is really damn cool. I do like the idea that even a rage mode Hulk has grown to have the wherewithal to know he's not really wanted anymore and chooses to leave Earth. It's especially brutal when Bruce has decided to start a life with Nat. It really seems like he didn't have a say in the decision to leave. Or this is maybe the beginning of Hulk and Banner sharing a dialogue that they both recognize, know, and at a minimum like Nat, and together agree that they're likely to hurt her if they remain. Earth hasn't been particularly kind to them, so maybe it's time they get off that rock. At this point, everyone stands around talking about how they're going down with the ship and going to die on Sokovia. Like, what the heck, guys? Aren't you well past that earlier risk assessment? You've now killed 99% of the robots and saved all but like one child. Why the rampant pessimism? Tony doesn't have some means of initiating the explosion remotely if you all got off now? It's just such a strange resignation from the team when, from what we've been shown, they've won and can now worry about saving themselves. To me, the final scene between Vision and Ultron is perfect. It's genuinely one of the best scenes in the movie.
Stark asked for a savior and settled for a slave.
I suppose we are both disappointments.
I suppose we are.
The dialogue throughout is excellent. Seeing two iterations of what are essentially the same being try to work through their differences is super intriguing. Here, Ultron is stripped bare and is able to hold this conversation without an ulterior motive, knowing he's already lost. This exchange creates a further and clearer distinction between Ultron and Vision, with them finding common ground, yet holding clear ideological differences.
They're doomed.
Yes. But a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts.
So we have this sentient AI confronting its own mortality and how that compares to the fleeting lives of humans. Having two super advanced androids contemplate human nature provides a really interesting look at the human condition.
There is grace in their failings. I think you missed that.
My only gripe with this scene is that Vision looks oddly desaturated. He isn't this washed out looking in the majority of the movie. It's one of the clearest examples of this movie not quite fully escaping the issue of iffy color corrections. But the whole thing ends on what is probably some of the most Whedon-y dialogue in the movie.
You're unbearably naive.
Well, I was born yesterday.
It's corny, but it just works for me, and I love the way it rounds out that story. The whole scene is just mwah, so good. As the movie's coming to a close, Tony founded a new Avengers facility, which I guess must be staffed by ex-SHIELD agents, maybe? We have our big three hanging out one more time, debating how Mjolnir works, bringing things back to that early party scene with the new context of Vision, and it's worth some pretty good laughs.
But if you put the hammer in an elevator,
It would still go up.
elevator's not worthy.
Tony is considering retirement. Maybe after Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron, he's realizing he causes just as much damage as he fixes. Creating a legion of suits was a mistake. Creating a legion of autonomous robots was a mistake. He's learning some pretty heavy lessons here. And after seeing Clint live a happy, quiet farm life, it clearly speaks to him. Meanwhile, Steve admits that avenging is pretty much all he has. Where they leave these characters off is incredibly effective at setting up civil war. They give it a nice dusting off of the hands, they're patting themselves on the back, job well done, and it immediately picks up with everyone understandably being pissed that an entire city was destroyed. But they wisely don't end this movie with Tony and Steve actively mad at each other. Instead, Tony's on a trajectory of learning to take responsibility and maybe wanting to live a different life. Meanwhile, Cap feels dug in further than ever, unsure of who he is outside of an Avenger. It opens questions of what does it mean to be a hero? Is it still heroic to solve a problem you caused? How do you run the cost-benefit analysis of saving human lives? These two have learned to work together incredibly well, and while they've clearly become friends, they are fundamentally different philosophically. Watching them change and grow together is the best part of the Infinity Saga. I know some people dislike the tease of cutting off Avengers Assemble, but how damn amazing is it that they had the patience to wait until the 22nd film to deliver that line. I love that restraint, and it makes the payoff so much better. Our end credit animation is just these marble statues. It's a cool pose, I guess, but it's just not that interesting to me. It instead feels like one of those overly long openings of prestige television. You know the ones I'm talking about? Like 90% of hour-long TV shows make use of them. While Thor's Infinity Stone exposition dump earlier was a little annoying, it did set up this fairly outstanding little moment of Thanos putting on the glove.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
It was just enough to give us a taste of his final voice and design, while clearly telegraphing that he was the big bad the next phase would all build towards. But really, who is he saying that to? And in response to what? He had no role in anything that just happened. It's just odd to reflect on that he is saying this despite seemingly never actively making a play for any stone since the first Avengers. In fact, he would have had the Mind Stone and sent it away with Loki, then losing it. The simplest explanation would be that this scene perhaps is meant to take place mere seconds after the tease at the end of the prior Avengers film. It's badass, but it's kind of funny the way it exists in a vacuum. Moving on to the leftovers for Age of Ultron, I think the blue highlights on Natasha's suit look super cool, but hot damn, would they ever be impractical for someone whose whole thing is being a stealthy spy? What is even coursing through those flashy strips anyways? Speaking of costumes, this might be my favorite Captain America look. I know, his Winter Soldier stealth suit is really cool, but that thing is tactical. It doesn't have the bright comic booky fun quality. So this one checks off all the right boxes for me. I absolutely love it. It's near identical to that scene in Civil War, but I prefer the extra red stripes and details around the center star in this version. The movie addresses how versatile vibranium is, but like, what can't this stuff do? They print an entire human out of it? One that can somehow materialize a new outfit out of nowhere and can phase through walls? What? Why? How? Best not to dwell on that, I suppose. Makes about as much sense as Cap's shield just infinitely bouncing around and coming back to him. And the absurdity of this pales in comparison with what vibranium has done for Wakanda. This has never stood out to me at all, even though this is like the 5th time I've seen this movie. But Danny Elfman did the score? What the hell? I only learned that because I saw someone mention Multiverse of Madness wasn't his first MCU score. He made decent use of some of the original themes, especially that iconic Avengers theme. But man, does it ever feel like he phoned this one in? Or maybe the studio wouldn't let him cut loose and go full Elfman? It wouldn't be the first time in this era that they hired someone and then didn't really let them do their thing. It's hard to say, but it's a pretty forgettable soundtrack. I actually had to go reading up on this further. It appears we can again blame Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee, but especially Perlmutter, for not wanting to pay Alan Silvestri's fee to return from the first film. They replaced him with Brian Taylor, who would have just done The Dark World. And as I said in my Thor review, this soundtrack was the best part of The Dark World. Yet at some point after hiring him, Perlmutter decided he didn't like it and then brought in Elfman. And their styles do not mesh well. They clearly just had separate perspectives on this movie. What a cluster. So not only did they have a replacement composer who likely had a shortened turnaround time to complete the film, then having to make room to collaborate with yet another late addition. So now we have too many cooks in the kitchen with not enough time to bake a cake. They either should have just paid Silvestri what he asked, or allowed literally any of the 3 composers to do their thing without all this micromanaging. So yeah, pretty weak score overall for this movie. Average at best, at least it didn't stand out in an actively negative way. Closing out this Age of Ultron review, I think a big separator between this movie and the original is that the growing franchise no longer allowed for more casual viewing. I'm sure you could walk into this movie and follow what's happening, but Age of Ultron marks a notable shift into being a full-scale saga. It exists as a crucial midpoint chapter of the larger novel that absolutely harms the ability for the general audience to quickly duck in and out of this series. But it does mean that this movie has aged like fine wine. They just served up a few pieces of cheese alongside that wine that didn't hold up quite so well. It builds off so much of what came before while setting the stage for plenty that comes after. Rewatching the full series and this movie has done nothing but enhance my appreciation for the larger storytelling and world building, even if this movie individually takes a few stumbles. Tony understandably gets the most screen time and development, as he's the most central to the events of this movie. Cap mostly exists to riff with Tony. Natasha and Bruce have all their screen time poured into a romantic B-plot that they largely bungle. It's a shame because I was really rooting for those two, and man, no wonder Hemsworth wanted out after this movie. They do nothing with Thor. He was so boring in this movie. Meanwhile, Hawkeye was an unexpected and clear standout. Mix in a stunning yet short turn from Vision, and I feel that only about half of the Avengers really got their due in this movie. The twins are both really cool, even if Pietro is mostly ignored, so again, we're working with about a 50-50 success rate. And damn, I wish they had made better use of his speedster abilities. Wanda was notably more developed and more exciting, and they do a decent job making me care about her brother's death, but I think the sadness we feel stems from empathy for Wanda and gratitude for Hawkeye rather than mourning for Pietro. So while it's sad to see him go, it is far from being a very impactful death, unfortunately. I think a lot of what holds this movie together for me is the fascinating and strangely unique villain of Ultron, carried through and beyond his shortcomings by a glorious performance from Spader. I don't think anyone else could have elevated this strangely silly, sadistic, silver sociopath anywhere near as well as he did. It was outstanding how well Whedon balanced the core cast of the first movie. Now add in the twins, give Hawkeye an actual presence for the main events, throw in a villain that requires substantially more screen time, finding space for cameos along the way, and it's no surprise that some of the spinning plates in this movie started to fall. But beyond a few wasted characters, the majority of my complaints boil down to small, mostly inconsequential moments. Like even the whole monster speech, which is jarring and terrible, it's still pretty minor, and it's wrapped up in a romance that was already struggling to matter or resonate. Which again means that that all falls under my umbrella of wasted or mismanaged characters. That really is the source of like 90% of this movie's issues. The soundtrack lands in a forgettable territory without being good or bad enough to really tip the scales for me. There was a trade-off of jokes having a worse success rate, but I think there is some really engaging, captivating dialogue. The action was exciting. Almost everything looked excellent. I consider Ultron an A-tier villain, and the pacing was surprisingly excellent for how much this movie had to accomplish. And while the movie had loads of great fights and singularly cool superhero moments. What it really gave me is something I desperately wanted from an Avengers movie. Not just the team at the height of their power, but something deeper. I'm going to borrow a screen grab I made a ways back from a Reddit user, Pigeon Wiggle, because I think it summed it up better than I could. They are shown hanging out as friends, fighting together as allies, hiding together as a family, and saving the day together as heroes.
We'll lose. And we'll do that together too.
I will continue to defend this movie. Taking it all into consideration, trying to put a number to this, I've been wobbling between like a 7 and a 7.5. Still pretty good. But I think I'm going to stick the final score at a kind of rocky 7.5. I like it a heck of a lot more than I dislike it, even if it doesn't quite live up to the original. So that rather generous score from me wildly still puts it in a number 6 spot overall. The franchise has succeeded far more often than it's failed, and a movie with such a high score from me still ranking as low as it does is a huge testament to that. But I think the deeper we get into this, the more we're going to start filling in those middle and lower range score slots. But I've surprised myself on this journey before, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. Since I brought it up before, I think a fitting interlude after Ultron would be to further expand on my love for A Knight's Tale. With Ultron being Vision's big debut, I'm throwing back to the first movie I remember seeing Bettany in. My parents took me to see this one in theaters when I was 9 years old, and I distinctly remember leaning over in the first few minutes to enthusiastically whisper, "What is this song?" Thus kicking off a lifelong fandom of all things Queen. While A Knight's Tale was no box office smash, I think it's found its audience over the years. Maybe it's too mainstream overall to be considered a cult classic, so I'll just say it's a classic. An early 2000s medieval action comedy starring on-the-rise pretty boy Heath Ledger with a lovable supporting cast and an absolutely delicious villain.
Beautiful, isn't she? A real thoroughbred trophy. Don't you think?
Seriously, what didn't people like about this? The basic setup is a knight, Sir Ector, suddenly dies mid-jousting tournament. Young Squire William Thatcher suits up in his place, setting him down a path of posing as a tournament knight to make ends meet. Alan Tudyk and Mark Addy are already hilarious together.
I miss you. Oh, hold, was that wrong?
Say something about her breasts. Yeah, you miss her breasts.
Then adding in Kate the blacksmith and Paul Bettany strutting around naked as real-life poet Geoffrey Chaucer turned ringside announcer. The entire movie is actually loosely based on Chaucer's work, so it's especially funny to me to drop him directly into these events. Layer in some quality training montages, fairly solid jousting action, some goofy anachronistic music and gags, a generally charming love story, an easy to root for rags to riches arc, and it's just pure entertainment. This movie was also my introduction to Rufus Sewell, who I think is a seriously underrated actor across his entire career, and I love seeing him as a villain. This is one of those movies I would then watch every time it was on TV, so I've probably seen it a good 10 times. Revisiting it most recently just a few years ago, and I loved it as much as ever. If you're looking for some easy watching, good fun, and a few belly laughs, you really can't go wrong with A Knight's Tale. Closing all of this up, this insanely long video, I should have assumed it would take a long time to talk about such big event films. The first Avengers felt like a massive conclusion, yet was also an origin all of its own, and served as an inciting incident that so many of the following films were able to build off of. And while the movie chose a less than cinematic visual language, it far from hurts the movie as it achieved other goals, and it remains an absolute blast from start to finish. It has such a wonderful balance of fan service, crowd-pleasing moments alongside some things that felt new, bright, and delightful, finding room for a unique level of quirkiness that is pure entertainment without ever dragging or feeling grating. While Age of Ultron plays out more like a middle chapter in a larger franchise, also setting up many things that came after. That will weigh against the film for many, as it dedicates a lot of its runtime to setting up subsequent films, although the majority of it plays out naturally and is well integrated into the plot. The ones that don't work so well stand out like a sore thumb. It stops it from standing on its own nearly as well as the original. But in the collective of this universe, seeing everything that built off of its story, it is critical viewing to the franchise. And I'm reviewing these from the perspective of someone who watches every one of the movies, so it doesn't really bother me that it's not a standalone film. The humor is a bit of an issue, but I found it near flawless in the first movie, and mostly impeccable in this one, with a few major missteps that really have dominated the conversation. I enjoyed the heck out of Ultron, and it's a shame he's never popped up again outside of the What If series, although it makes more sense with him than some of the other villains to be killed off permanently. So while he was a one and done, the movie deserves to be showered with praise for also giving us good Hawkeye, Wanda, Claw, and Vision. Those characters all rule. It's wild how much these two movies together influence the rest of the MCU, not just in terms of setting up future events, but through that Marvel creative committee who took so many of the wrong lessons from these films' success. Across the two films, they tipped more gray, relying on some insert joke here style humor, and an increasingly formulaic approach to storytelling. We have the benefit of hindsight that we can blame that specific group for those negative influences on the larger franchise, and we've now had multiple examples to prove they're shaking free of those creative shackles. Looking even beyond the in-universe influences, it has been wild to see studio after studio trip over themselves to recreate this success, and nobody has even come close. Marvel is insanely lucky that Joss Whedon didn't become a persona non grata any sooner than he did, because he's now a permanent stain on the franchise. I had the benefit of having watched and rewatched these movies numerous times without that knowledge, so my opinions were largely formed a long time ago without being mixed up with those complicated circumstances. But if you want to get into this franchise, you can't really skip over these two movies. So it requires some degree of separating art and artist, and I would recommend focusing on the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who made these movies, whose work can still be individually admired and appreciated. Hopefully that mindset allows these movies to endure, and we can still admire them for what they are. Maybe going so far as to thank Whedon for some of the positives he brought to the franchise, while also throwing out an equally well-earned fuck you in his direction.
Language!
Right. Sorry, Cap. Having now reviewed half of the Infinity Saga in only 5 videos, I'm gonna break free of the chronological reviews to instead hop on the Spidey hype train. Madam Web bombed so hard that Sony is re-releasing every Spider-Man movie in theaters. They can say it's for the Columbia Pictures anniversary, but I think we all see what's going on here. So I'm going to attempt to vaguely match that monthly schedule, capping it all off with a review of No Way Home. Long term, I hope to someday catch up on both the MCU and DCEU, as well as someday talking about as many comic book movies from outside these franchises as possible. X-Men, Fantastic Four, Blade, all Sony's strange non-Spider-Man films. You name it. Someday we'll get there. It's just tough when they keep releasing like 20 new things a year. Spider-Man has been one of my favorite comic book characters since I was a kid, and I'm looking forward to further exploring that side of my own superhero fandom. Then I can tackle the remaining 11 movies after that. Holy cow, 12 out of 23, huh? That means I'm past the halfway mark now. Hot damn! The slow build of viewership for this series of videos hasn't quite happened yet, but I'm enjoying the hell out of the process. I'll keep going. Maybe someday they'll find that larger viewership. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. There have been plenty of fun discussions and encouraging comments along the way, so I'm looking forward to plenty more of that. Thank you to patrons of the channel for their additional support, and I hope to see you all again soon.